Now, I see a problem in that's the right to buy legislation. Council houses become second homes.
Whether that's directly through, for instance, air pollution and water pollution. And a policy which seeks to deal with that separately is out of date. We're talking in this conference, in this motion as amended, about farm policy, not specifically anymore the common agricultural policy. Now, whether it is something we can do together with our colleagues elsewhere in Europe, as we've sought to do, we've sought to lead reforms on the CAP for well over 35 years that I'm aware of, and some of you in the audience may have even longer memories. We need to continue that process, whether we're in Europe, in the EU, or whether we're outside it, talking about a British agricultural policy and a devolved agricultural policy. Well, what do we need to do? Let's recognise the perverse and inefficient nature of our current agricultural policy. The fact is that about £3 billion per annum is paid out in farm support, and because most of that is not related to the environment, it's farm income support, and it is paid in proportion to the amount of land that you farm. Inevitably, a disproportionate amount of it goes to the largest farmers, as Phil Bennion has referred to. So we need to have a more efficient policy and one which takes account of the social and environmental costs of farming and delivers public benefits from public money. Very difficult to say that is something that is achieved by the current policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Cara Jenkinson to stand by, please? And I now call Councillor Peter Thornton from Westmoreland and Lonsdale.
Another one from Cumbria, I'm afraid. I want to speak briefly about housing in rural areas and planning policy and the future effect of driverless electric cars on planning policy. Now, I live in a small valley just north of Kendal. If you've got children that are fond of Postman Pat, you'll know it as Greendale. It's actually called Longsleddle. And in 1841, according to the records, our valley had 175 inhabitants. Today, it has 75. We've lost 100 people. Less than half its former population. Because of this, the church has recently closed, the school is long gone, and the farmers are gradually leaving to be replaced by second homeowners. We have the same number of homes in the valley, but we have far fewer people actually living in them. For example, my wife and I are happy in our 3-bedroomed farmhouse. That allows us to have a guest room and a study. But in 1891, 12 people lived there. It was a 4-bedroom farmhouse in those days, of course. Our valley lost 30 bedrooms or so when they were converted into bathrooms. We don't live 12 to a small house anymore. Consequently, unless we build more homes, the population declines and the community is weakened. So I asked the question, why don't we build more? Because didn't pollute, kill, and didn't cause congestion? What if all cars were electric, charged from renewable sources? What if they were computer controlled and perfectly safe? And what if they parked themselves outside our town centres? Or ultimately were shared among us all? A private taxi at your beck and call. Would this change our view of development in the countryside? The Industrial Revolution, the Internet Revolution, they've changed our countryside in fundamental ways. And the approaching huge transport revolution, which we can't underplay, will do so as well. Are we ready for it as Liberal Democrats? Are we going to adopt our planning guidelines to take account of changes that are just around the corner? Now, I speak in support of this motion and in the hope that Liberal Democrats will, in the near future, be at the forefront of designing a planning framework which fully understands the far-reaching effect of autonomous electric vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Michael Mullaney to stand by, please? And I now call Cara Jenkinson from Haringey, who wishes to speak for the motion as a whole.
Hi, conference. Well, I'm not from Cumbria. I'm from London. So what am I doing standing here talking about the countryside? Because thriving rural communities matter to us all. I want to describe to you two possible futures. The first is the dark one. Due to the high cost of housing and poor transport, our countryside is emptying of local people. We've left the EU, so we don't have Europeans to harvest our food and process it either. So our farms are struggling, and we're eating chlorinated chicken. There are still some older people living in the countryside, but social care is pretty much non-existent. Our cities, on the other hand, are overcrowded. Children grow up in overpriced flats, mostly attached to their screens, rarely leaving their neighbourhoods, let alone visiting the countryside. There is another future, a much brighter one. Here, there are thriving rural businesses with high-speed internet connections, employing local young people. Some of our local rural towns are growing and linked by really good public transport. Our natural capital is flourishing. Hundreds of mini Eden projects are running, showcasing nature and farming to millions of school children who learn that vegetables don't start out life in cling-filled packets. This motion supports that second vision, and it is in the interest of everyone, urban and rural dwellers alike, that this is the future we get. The Brexit vote highlighted a polarised, divided country. The metropolitan elite did not look outside their city walls and did not listen enough. The Conservatives, pervasive as they are in the Shires, do not really listen either, unless you're a wealthy landowner, as Theo and Liz said. And Labour is still, as it always was, focused on its urban heartlands. But I am really proud that the Lib Dems have always championed our rural communities, and I wholeheartedly encourage you to support this motion. Thank you.
Can I ask Jenny Marr to stand by, please? And I now call Michael Mullaney from Bosworth, who wishes to speak for lines 13 and 14.
It's excellent to see a motion highlighting the often forgotten problems of rural Britain on the agenda today. In my own county of Leicestershire, rural areas face a particular problem because we are the worst funded county council in Britain. And as a consequence, we often see many rural services, as well as urban services, losing out. We recently had our budget, which saw further cutbacks to bus subsidies within the county. Now, if you're in an urban part of the county, generally speaking, there will be enough customers using the buses to keep them profitable. But if you're in the rural villages, the chances are, without the subsidies, they won't continue. And this will mean villages losing further services, villages which have often lost their post offices, their pubs, their shops, more and more services being lost in rural areas. And in Leicestershire, we also have one of the worst funded schools in Britain as well, which again means people are losing out locally. In fact, one head teacher last year wrote to the government to say they were considering a 4.5-day week for the school to close down at lunchtime on Friday because there wasn't the funding to keep it open 5 days a week because of the poor funding that Leicestershire schools get. And we've seen that in the Social Mobility Commission report, which showed that the East Midlands had the lowest social mobility in Britain, and my own borough of Hinckley and Bosworth had the 10th worst in the country. People's opportunities are being reduced and cut back because of the lack of support for education in counties like Leicestershire. Now, we've got all Conservative MPs in Leicestershire. We've got a Conservative County Council. Now, the DUP were able to get £1 billion for Northern Ireland through the hung Parliament for their support. Why can't Tory MPs in places like Leicestershire and other underfunded counties use their position to demand the fair funding that rural communities deserve? Because at the present, the rural communities are losing out under the Tories. They've taken rural areas for granted. We have got to be the party that give opportunities to rural people. They're in this motion. We can show that the Lib Dems don't take rural communities for granted, that we'll fight for them, that we'll fight for their services. And if we start campaigning on motions like this in rural areas, we can start taking on the complacent Tories and start recovering our support in the rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Stuart Redaway to stand by, please? And I now call Jenny Marr from Edinburgh North East and Leith, who is a first-time speaker at the Federal Conference.
And also definitely not from Cumbria, which you can probably tell by the accent. So, yeah, I live in Edinburgh, as my local party betrays. Doesn't betray, I'm actually a country bumpkin. I grew up in Selkirk, a small town in the Scottish borders, and I left for the bright lights of Aberdeen when I was 17. I went to uni, I lived in the city for 8 years, and then I made the leap back to the countryside and lived down a very precarious farm track in rural Aberdeenshire. Now, I've experienced the contrast of living both ways of life, and today I kind of want to focus on, I want to speak to the wider Lib Dem values that I think this motion encompasses, which I think is really important here. Because for me, fundamentally, this is about inequality. I'm tired of rural communities being an afterthought, of the problems always being fixed after there's been a flood or some kind of disaster. I have a friend who lives in the city who, miraculously for somebody under 30, has managed to save a deposit. Now, she's from the country, and the money she's saved doesn't get her much in Edinburgh, but it would buy her a flat outright back home, and she doesn't want to go. The wages are too low, the transport is too poor, and she's got pretty much no reason to go back. And for the young families that have managed to get on the property ladder down there, they're now stuck. They can't afford the bigger house that they need for their little ones and their growing family, and that's their only option because of the lack of social housing. This stress is compounded by the closure of their local banks and the threat of bus services being pulled. And then there's the weather. So a few years ago, whilst I was living down that dirt track, it started to rain, which you would think wouldn't really be a big deal in Scotland. But eventually it got to the point where I thought I'm probably going to have to build an ark. So I turned on the TV to see a reporter in the car park of my local co-op, surrounded by water, cars more afloat than cars really ever should be. So I put my wellies on, I squidged my way down the dirt track to discover that the road at the end was actually now a river. And the folk that I'd intended to help in the village, I couldn't reach them. So I was trapped for days. And as a type 1 diabetic cut off completely from any kind of health services, I was really scared. And that's just one example. It's not the worst. Business owners lost their livelihoods. Farmers have been trying to pull their livestock out of massive piles of snow in recent weeks, and they deserve something better than they're getting now. So I completely agree with what's said in the motion. Let's build houses, but can we build communities as well? Communities are vigorous, they're resilient, and they're resourceful, but they deserve far more than they're getting at the moment. Let's improve the transport links and fight for better broadband, which is so vital in those areas now forced to bank online in the absence of any local branches. So let's remember what this paper is trying to do. This is for the isolated, the poor, the elderly, and so many more. Society can only thrive if everyone plays their part, so please support this motion.
Thank you. Can I ask David Chalmers to stand by, please? And we now have Stuart Redaway from North Hartland Stevenage, who wishes to speak against lines 34 to 89.
So, good afternoon. I find that rural people tend to plead in a very special way. I think this is hardly, in my view, a policy motion. It's more special pleading on some topics which are really more general than just being rural. There is no definition of a rural area or a coastal town, so there's not specific policy in here. Many issues are general, not just rural. For example, affordable and social housing, brownfield sites, which I would include farm buildings as, second homes are perhaps a worse problem in many rural areas, but it can be just a general issue. Broadband, we should subsidise to a reasonable degree, and other services, but cost should be an issue as well. People are free not to move to an expensive area or one that lacks certain facilities, and more controversially, if something specific is a problem for somebody in a rural area, they can move away. Young person's bus discount. This isn't a specifically rural problem, it's a general issue. Community hubs, again, for co-locating various services is a good general idea. And flood prevention is not just a rural issue. Towns also get flooded. For example, York, or even London, where the Thames Barrier was constructed. So I think we should tackle more issues in a general terms rather than have too much emphasis on rural special pleading. I plan to probably abstain on this motion.
Thank you. Sally Burnell, can you stand by, please? And I now call David Chalmers from North Devon, who wishes to speak for the motion as a whole.
Good afternoon, Conference. I would like to speak in favour of this motion. I'm the PPC for Torridge and West Devon, and like other speakers before me, I'd really like to thank the working group to have put this motion together, and I think that it redresses a balance that we need in our party and the country as a whole to actually be speaking up for the issues on rural communities. Now, my constituency, Torridge and West Devon, is probably one of the most beautiful in the country. I'm sure there are others who will argue that theirs are as well. But it is the second largest, and I can testify during the general election just how difficult it was getting around. From one end to the other, it takes 2 hours, and my poor car, it lost 2 tyres, and its exhaust fell off during my sort of getting around. Now, I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago on Brexit in my constituency, and a question came from the audience, which I think is really relevant to today and actually speaks for all that we're doing. They asked me, what are you doing to actually address the real reasons why people voted for Brexit in this area? And they have real legitimate concerns. The lack of investment in our infrastructure, our schools, our pupils are paid less in other parts of the country. Our health services are underfunded. There was even talk last year of closing the A&E in Barnstable Hospital, which would have meant people in my constituency having to travel almost 2 hours, 2.5 hours in some cases, down the same roads that I drove during the general election to actually access those services. There is a real concern that we don't have investment in our jobs and skills, and as others have said, keeping our young people in those rural communities and offering them an opportunity to move forward. And as we've heard earlier today around Brexit, and that now that we have taken the position that we are going to oppose this, what is happening to our country, that I think that this will send a really clear message as well to communities like mine that we are trying to address their issues, and that as we oppose and stop this madness that is taking place, that we will look at addressing those issues. So I would say to you today, please vote for this motion and go forward and actually look at how we can bring more value and listen to the voices of our rural communities in our policy making and as we go forward in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles Tucker, can you stand by, please? And I now call Sally Brunel from Waltham Forest, who wishes to speak for line 77.
Thank you, Zoe. I just want to make a few brief remarks about line 77, which is around upholding high animal welfare standards as a public good. I fully support this sentiment, and I was a strong advocate for it as I'm a member of the Federal Policy Committee when we were discussing this paper. I see animal welfare as a fundamental Liberal Democrat issue. In fact, I joined the party 20 years ago as an A-level student because I attended a speech by Paddy Ashdown, and he talked about animal welfare, and it really spoke to me, and I signed up, and I've been a member ever since. And I know I'm not the only one. There's a fairly active Liberal Democrats animal welfare group on Facebook, which I'm a member of. But the reason for me highlighting it now is because I think that the Tories and Labour are currently in a game of one-upmanship around animal welfare. There's been lots and lots of headlines recently, and I don't think any of us saw fox hunting as being a major election issue, but it was. And I think, we weren't part of that story. Whatever you think about fox hunting, as a major animal welfare issue, we should have been part of it, part of that debate. And I don't think we should underestimate just how much the electorate cares about animal welfare. I understand that animal welfare isn't just a rural issue, and I'm not from a rural area, but I'm really pleased to see it in this policy paper and the motion, and I would like to see it being given a higher profile across all of our policy areas. Membership of the EU has had enormous benefits for animal welfare across the whole of the EU, and in fact across the world. And I think we have to make sure that animal welfare is not another victim of Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you. Can Philip Knowles stand by? Philip Knowles, stand by. And can we now have Charles Tucker from West Worcestershire, who wishes to speak for lines 81 to 89.
Good afternoon, Conference. I'd like to speak very briefly about the issues of flooding. It is an issue very much in rural areas, just as much as in town areas. And being, as is the case, the Environment Agency is forced to take account of the cost-benefit of any schemes that it does, schemes in rural areas are much more difficult to justify because of the smaller number of people in those rural communities. So often, villages and smaller communities are overlooked or bypassed and have a much greater difficulty in getting the Environment Agency to agree schemes which will protect them. And those communities have learnt over the time that really to get a scheme, they have to work very, very hard. I'm speaking today as somebody who was the ex-chairman, or I am the ex-chairman, of the National Flood Forum until 2016. And I've seen that the National Flood Forum is a charity that supports and represents communities that are at risk of flooding, and have had extremely good experience with many communities in helping them to develop community flood groups which take forward self-help and assist in sorting out their own problems, as I mentioned before, they have to do. So our motion is good, but it is not really going into sufficient depth to deal with this issue. And I think this is a Liberal Democrat issue because of the emphasis in rural communities of the need to involve the community. We talk about working with nature, and that is essential, but it will not prevent flooding. We need to really, as our motion, we need to be including the need to give better support to communities that have flooded or at risk of flooding. However much we aim to reduce flood risk, many communities are being flooded every day by sudden deluges that overwhelm existing drainage systems. Climate change is making our weather more extreme, leading to more and more intense rainstorms. So we need, and we should be leading the call for, a strategic approach to assisting the communities affected based on encouraging and reinforcing self-help through community flood groups. We should recognize that local communities often have the best handle on what works in their area and can utilize local networks to support themselves. Statutory bodies such as the Environment Agency and the highway authorities involved in flooding have learned over the years and through hard experience that the best way to help communities to recover from flooding is to listen to those communities and to base future action on the local knowledge they can provide.
Can you draw your remarks to a close, please?
Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker before the summation is Philip Knowles from Richmond in Yorkshire. And he was a first-time speaker at Federal Conference.
Good afternoon. I live in Richmond in North Yorkshire. We're not in Cumbria, but we have a border with Cumbria, so we're nearly there. And our constituency is bigger than most counties and goes to within about 10 miles of the east coast, so it's a big area. We've recently been fighting the closure of the mental health wards in Northallerton Friarage Hospital. One of the results of this closure will be what they call the organic dementia patients moving from Northallerton to Bishop Auckland, which is in County Durham. For somewhere like Hawes, that's a 50-mile round trip by generally going to be an elderly person visiting another elderly person with very little in the way of bus routes or anything. So it's relying on friends and family to support them. They're also now planning to close the A&E in the Friarage, which will mean that someone in Hawes will have a 60-mile journey to the nearest A&E. For the lady who was from Witney, that is like saying to someone who lives in London, your nearest A&E is going to be Oxford. And the real issue is that these decisions are made by our local health trust, which is based in Middlesbrough, as in not in the county. Our local mental health trust is based in Darlington, as in not in the county. And they're now proposing to close the wards in Harrogate, which is in the county, and move them to the same places. So a 50, 60-mile journey to do that. Now, the issue is the decisions are not being monitored or controlled by local representatives of the people. And the Health Trust, the Health Scrutiny Committee strongly complained about this decision to close the mental health wards, but it was ignored, and now the closure is going to take place. What we need to do is get more control for the rural areas within the rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, can we have Heather Kidd from Ludlow, who was the chair of the Policy Working Group, to summate the motion?
Thank you, Conference. A wide-ranging and interesting debate, even if I did leap out of my seat a couple of times. What we tried to do was set a vision for the countryside because nobody does that at present. We understood that the whole piece of work was going to be long and complex. And in 10,000 words, putting all the detail in that you need to actually provide everything that we would like to do and be as radical as we would like to be is a very difficult way forward. We understood that actually the agriculture part of it, which will include a lot of the land management, will need quite a lot of extra work doing to it, especially around CAP. Could I mention to the speaker on CAP that actually that was quite an old version of CAP. It's all moving on and was going to be moved on anyway by the EU. We actually do need to have a whole new policy area on that, and that's the intention of this work. Our vision for the countryside is that one of equality. People living in the countryside needed a voice, and I think that that's what many of the speakers were trying to say today, that we need a voice and we have equal rights to those living in towns. So I'm quite disturbed that actually anyone here should say that if you don't like what you get in the countryside, you can go and live somewhere else. People living in the countryside do so because they have family support, they have social sustainability, they have childcare that they can't afford through other means. They're called parents and grandparents. And all of those issues are issues that people have to take into consideration when it comes to where they live. We were trying to put a vision in place that stopped us in rural communities from becoming a rural desert. And many of you actually went back to that. Liz Leffman was very good at looking at health services. The last speaker also on mental health produced details around mental health. Ambulance response times, a whole chunk of my division has 0 targets met on ambulance response times. We have a second-rate service. So I think one of the things that didn't come out today that ought to be fleshed out is that rural communities include those coastal communities that also don't get any real support from government. Torridge in Devon, very good points around health, jobs, skills, and young people, and keeping our communities. If you keep a balanced community, then actually you will begin to keep your young people, give them the support they need. Yes, it does need to be more radical, Ian Stewart from Cumbria. Absolutely it does. We need to push at the boundaries, but we need to have a basic level there of where we need to be. At the moment, the rural communities over broadband and many of those services drop off the edge, and we still don't get any of those not spots being filled. And there are still people on dial-up, and there are still people on less than 2 megs. So actually what we put in was something that would be usable. Of course we want more, of course we want to be ambitious, but actually we don't even get the basics of many of the urban areas at the present time. Animal welfare is important to most of our farmers, and it's a way of life for them. And in fact, our animal welfare standards on farms in particular are a lot higher than many of those in Europe. The council tax issue on second homes, yes, there's a real problem around business rates and so on, and it's a good point to actually look at, and I think we ought to take that back and look at council tax. Phil Benyon's points around the agriculture, we've had long discussions within the group, and yes, that's part of the way forward we need to go when we look at and do more work as a party on farming and agriculture and land management in the future. We have lots of support for the young person's bus pass, and I agree, if you can have a senior rail card, why can't we have a rail card for young people if that's going to enable people to stay in the countryside? All good points, all good things that are actually useful for our young people to get to training, employment, and allow them to stay living in the countryside. There were such a huge range of issues. I think what we haven't touched on as well is runoff. Runoff can cause fundamental problems on roads, highways, and so on. And the there is a big elephant in the room over fairer funding for our councils, because many rural county councils and district councils are very, very poorly funded and are in the bottom 40 for education and so on. So all of those issues are issues that we as Liberal Democrats have sitting in that paper. Many of those issues that have been raised today are actually in the paper, but not in the depth that you would require. We did not decide to give you a definition of affordable housing. Affordable housing is such a difficult thing to define. We actually use that word for social housing as well. Social housing becomes something that many people don't like to listen to. They think it's something for substandard people. Affordable housing should come in a whole range of different guises, whether it's social rented, whether it's part buy, or whether it's affordable to buy. That's all affordable housing, and all housing will be unaffordable to somebody. So I urge you to vote for this paper. It does need some more work in some areas because of the detail we require, but it's a liberal paper. It's about equality for those of us who live in rural areas. It's about equal rights. And it's about giving rural areas something to hang on to and something for us to campaign on. And we now need to work on the campaign areas so that councillors out there have something to go and say to their public. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move to the vote, while I still have your attention, I'd just like to remind people and tell those who've joined us partway through the debate that the Fixing Rail Franchising motion won the emergency motions ballot. It will be debated at 10:10 tomorrow. You can find it on page 21 of Conference Daily. Please do put in a speaker's card if you wish to speak on that. We will now move to the vote. So, can I see all of those who are in favour of the motion raise your voting card with the word voting towards me, please? Thank you very much. And can I see all those against? I see no cards against. I think that's passed NEMCON. Oh, one card against? Okay, that's overwhelmingly passed anyway. Thank you very much, Conference. Thank you to all those who put in cards, and thank you to those who kept to time. I was just about able to squeeze in everyone who submitted a card. Can I thank my aide on the stage, Paul Tilsley, my aide in the hall, Nick DaCosta, and I now hand over to the next session. Thank you very much.
Now, I see a problem in that's the right to buy legislation. Now, I see a problem in that's the right to buy legislation. Council houses become second homes.
Whether that's directly through, for instance, air pollution and water pollution. And a policy which seeks to deal with that separately is out of date. We're talking in this conference, in this motion as amended, about farm policy, not specifically anymore the common agricultural policy. Now, whether it is something we can do together with our colleagues elsewhere in Europe, as we've sought to do, We've sought to lead reforms on the CAP for well over 35 years that I'm aware of, and some of you in the audience may have even longer memories. We need to continue that process, whether we're in Europe, in the EU, or whether we're outside it, talking about a British agricultural policy and a devolved agricultural policy. Well, what do we need to do? Let's recognise the perverse and inefficient nature of our current agricultural policy. The fact is that about £3 billion per annum is paid out in farm support, and because most of that is not related to the environment, it's farm income support, and it is paid in proportion to the amount of land that you farm. Inevitably, a disproportionate amount of it goes to the largest farmers, as Phil Bennion has referred to. So we need to have a more efficient policy and one which takes account of the social and environmental costs of farming and delivers public benefits from public money. Very difficult to say that is something that is achieved by the current policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Cara Jenkins?
And Laura's question is, what advice do you have for Labour-facing seats, as most of our target seats are Tory seats?
Right. Well, Laura is, of course, our PPC in Sheffield Hallam. You heard her speaking this morning. Great. And, you know, I would say a very high probability of becoming our next MP. But I think if you're dealing with the Labour Party, they have been on a roll, and they didn't actually win the election. To hear them sometimes you'd think they had, but they have been relatively on a roll. But I think the starting point is to talk to them about Brexit. It's a deeply awkward, embarrassing subject for the Labour Party because the party leadership is very pro-Brexit. They sat on their hands during the referendum campaign. They actively worked with Theresa May to expedite the Brexit agenda in Parliament. You probably saw only yesterday Jeremy Corbyn saying what a terrible thing the single market was. Now, the reasons why the Labour leadership has taken up this position are several. I mean, one is ideological, that a lot of them are still trapped in the language of the 1970s. They see the European Union as some kind of capitalist plot. It's standing in the way of creating a true socialist nirvana in Britain. The vast majority of Labour MPs and members and trade unions know this is complete nonsense, but nonetheless, that's where the leader is. The other, I think, is a calculation, a rather cynical calculation, that Brexit, if it happens, will be a mess. It will be portrayable as a Tory Brexit from which they can then benefit and expedite going to government. So for a variety of reasons, Corbyn and his acolytes are pro-Brexit, and you should never, ever let them off the hook. Because at the moment, they're saying different things to different people in London, where there is a very strong pro-Remain mood, in Scotland, some of the big cities. They will like you to believe that they're campaigning to keep us in the European Union. They're not. And you should expose the hypocrisy and the ambiguity of it. So I think that's the first biggest. And the other is that there are many parts of the country that have Labour councils that have become complacent, in extreme cases kind of corrupt with a small c, but certainly Tammany Hall machines. I know from experience, I was once part of one in my early life in Glasgow, but there are some councils that continue like that to this day, and very often we are the only people effectively up against them. I mean, a good example is Manchester, where I think there are 99 Labour councillors and 1 Lib Dem and no Tories. And it's the Lib Dem that is the opposition and is the effective opposition in Manchester. And there are many parts of the UK, Hull, Newcastle, Sheffield, Oldham, elsewhere, where we have long been the alternative to the Labour Party, offering competent, much more inclusive local government. So I think a combination of Brexit and reminding people just how bad Labour government can be at a local level, that's, to my mind, an effective counter.
Thank you. Laura, would you like to ask a supplementary question?
Yeah, I would, thank you. I think one of the challenges that we have in places like Sheffield, where we're in second place and where we're fighting Labour, is that we also have to sort of appeal to Conservative tactical voters, which I think a lot of people that are in Labour-facing areas will sort of be familiar with. And sort of at the same time, sort of we're also, rightly, our parliamentary party is sort of holding the government accountable for some of the awful things that they're doing. So we're sort of in this slightly delicate position, I think, across the Labour-facing areas of the country, which I think will be familiar to a lot of people. Do you have any advice for us in sort of how we kind of square that circle?
Well, it's not our fault that we're operating in the first-past-the-post system. And we shouldn't be apologetic when we position ourselves as being anti-Labour in some areas and anti-Tories in the other. I mean, we would love to have a more nuanced approach to politics, which we would have if the voting system was reformed. But it isn't. It's the reality we have to deal with. And in areas like yours, Laura, I mean, it is a question of getting the Tories to understand the practical reality, that if they don't want a Labour MP, we are the alternative. It's a very simple message, and until the voting system has changed, we've got to stick with it.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question we've had submitted. It's from Catherine Macmillan, and Catherine wants to know, should we as Liberal Democrats, be more vocal in our support of university lecturers in their strike against severe pension reductions in order to protect the universities?
Well, I have been vocal, I have supported them, and I have respected the strike, and in some cases it's been a bit irritating. I had a couple of big events in universities. It would have involved crossing the picket lines, but I took the view we shouldn't. Actually, the university lecturers have a very strong case. It's based on the way that the pension system is being redesigned. What used to happen is, different universities basically cross-supported each other, cross-subsidized each other through the pension scheme. Because this government has brought in a new law about allowing universities to go bankrupt, some of the stronger universities, like Oxbridge, are no longer willing to support the university pension scheme. As a result, it's become much more expensive, less sustainable, and the benefits to the lecturers are being cut. It's not their fault. So I haven't gone out advocating strike action, but I do respect it. And I think you should always remind people that when we were in the coalition government, there was enormous pressure on us to curb the right to strike. I think when I came into my office, I had a list of 19 anti-trade union measures that were proposed by the Tories, and we just wouldn't go anywhere near it. Because although the trade unions don't support us, most of them, they do have their basic workers' rights. We respect them, and they include the right to strike. So my position is absolutely clear that we should be behind the lecturers in the universities, we should respect their right to strike, and we shouldn't cross their picket lines. Thank you.
Catherine, you...
Yes, thank you very much. I am one of the striking lecturers. I'm very surprised to find myself in this position, and I don't want to be there. The reason I ask this question, and the reason I wonder if there's more that can be done by the party to support it, is that the universities are particularly susceptible to the damage that Brexit will cause. The destruction of the pension, probably for political reasons, increases the turmoil in our universities at a time when Britain, all Britons, will need universities more than ever.
No, you're right. What I have done is I've written to the university's minister making out a reasoned case for looking afresh at the whole way that the university system operates around pensions and trying to find a way through it. So we are actively engaged. It's not just a question of sitting back. I think the other point you make is absolutely fundamental, that when we talk about the casualties of Brexit, most of the attention tends to focus on these rather televisual industries like the car industry, but actually universities are going to be hammered in several respects. First of all, they potentially lose access to a lot of their research funding, and Britain gets more in terms of research funding than we put into it. They lose access to European staff, and they lose access to European students, and the exchange scheme around Erasmus is also potentially compromised. We're already seeing, I go to a lot of universities, and they're already suffering quite a serious brain drain of their talented staff, and this, I'm afraid, is going to get worse. So, yeah, we should be speaking up for universities and link it strongly with the Brexit issue.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a couple of questions now from the auditorium. So if you can wait until the handheld mic arrives to you. And so I'm initially going to take one, the gentleman over there on the, in the centre. The hands up, thank you.
Thanks. William Barter from Manchester. You've spoken already twice in your answers about Brexit and how we should call out Labour's hypocrisy in not living up to their principles, but also its impact on society and universities. I wondered if you could perhaps speak slightly about how we can address our own principles when we are calling Labour out. For example, we are committed constitutionally to promote the free movement of people, not just workers. This makes a big difference. It's something we see in society with universities, and it's something that Labour are not behind. Maybe you could speak slightly about how you think we can best promote the freedom of movement of people.
Yes, you're right. It is a bigger concept than just labour markets. And of course, I wouldn't regard them as workers in the conventional sense, but one of the biggest strengths of British universities is the substantial number of overseas students who come here, some from Europe, many from outside Europe. It's a great benefit to our economy. It helps with the diversity of our society, and it's an extremely positive thing to do, and we've got to speak up for it. And again, I'd encourage you to go, if you are focusing on the Labour Party, go back to what Jeremy Corbyn said yesterday. It was, I think it's the first time he's done it for a long time, but it was a frontal negative attack on the whole principle of the single market, which of course has as its core freedom of movement as well as free trade.
Thank you. Take
the
gentleman there, thank you. Yes, just if you'd like to just wait for the microphone to arrive. Thank you.
Stephen Broadhead, Macclesfield. The Welsh Assembly, it is rumoured, are proposing proportional representation, single transferable vote. Can you comment on this?
Sorry?
The question was, it's rumoured that the Welsh Assembly are looking at the single transferable vote. And
yeah, well, I mean, that is the best form of proportional representation and the purest form, and it does work. And if you want to see the single transferable vote in action, you don't need to go to Ireland. It operates in Scottish local government. It's been highly beneficial in producing what used to be large numbers of one-party fiefdoms into much more plural, varied, democratic institutions. Scottish local government doesn't have a great deal of freedom, but it works well, and it's a good advertisement for that kind of model. But I mean, I don't want to get into a theological argument about the differences between the system that works for the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament, which is EV+, and single transferable vote. I mean, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. I actually think that the present system that operates at Assembly and Scottish Parliament level is a good one because it keeps quite a strong element of the constituency link, which people do value. But you know, SDV undoubtedly is the pure form of PR.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to some questions that have been submitted in advance. And I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to link together. They're both on diversity. So one's from Lisa Smart and one's from Jerry Jerome. So the questions are, what can we all do to improve the representation of underrepresented groups in local government? And following on from that, and also diversity within the party?
Yes, well, this is, diversity comes, of course, in different dimensions. We've got gender, sexuality, disability, other forms. I mean, the difficult issue, which has been put into focus by the Alderdice report of the last few weeks, is about ethnic diversity. I mean, if you just look round the hall, we're not representative of modern Britain. It is a, you know, 95, 98% all-white gathering here. And that I mean, that is, you know, the way our membership is. It doesn't come from overt prejudice, I know that. And if we saw overt prejudices in our local parties, we would immediately jump on it. But it comes from actually being rather complacent and just accepting that that's the way things are. Our strength came as a political party in Parliament, certainly from the suburbs, the prosperous suburbs of cities, and from the southwest, which were predominantly white areas, and the membership tended to reflect that. And we haven't consciously, positively gone out and tried to diversify our membership and our local government and national government base in the way we should have. And it is a major challenge now to do it. I'm supporting strongly Sal Brinton's push to get all minority shortlists. It's something I think we have to do. There are legal problems with it, but it is the right thing to do. I mean, the uncomfortable truth is that actually the Tory party, partly because of Cameron's initiatives, has got a more ethnically balanced parliamentary party than we have or have had. And we have to do something about it. It's easier to do something about it at local level, and I would urge those of you who are involved in local government and campaigning in local government to do something, because one of the advantages of a local government perspective is that you very often get 3-member wards. And in a 3-member ward, you should be able to get reasonable diversity, certainly of gender and ethnicity, particularly in big cities. And it's a very simple thing to do. And I would hope that we're much more proactive in doing it.
Thank you. So if I come to Lisa first, do you have a supplementary question?
So it's just to echo what Vince is saying, really. I asked the question because it's the role of all of us in this room to better represent the communities we seek to represent. And I'm really pleased you used the word we a lot there, Vince, because it's not just your job, it's not just Sal's job, it's everybody's job to do a better job of this. I know you take this really seriously. You were at the round table discussing the Fawcett Society's report about how we get local government to work better for women. But it's just because I've got the microphone, I'm going to use it. We all need to do better to make sure that our teams that we put up in local elections better represent the communities we seek to serve. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And Jerry Jerome, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, I do. Actually, my question was born out of frustration of being a member for a very long time of the Lib Dems and coming to these conferences and seeing actually the actual percentage dropping over the last few years of ethnic minorities. And I wondered whether what this current attempt, how would that be different to several other initiatives that we've had in the past?
Well, I think what is different is that, well, I wouldn't say it's totally different, yes, but I can assure you that I, the party president, and the people in leadership roles in the party do recognise that this is now our biggest challenge in terms of the party itself. And I'm absolutely committed to dealing with it. I feel emotionally about it because, as most of you know, I think I had a mixed family myself, and I've, over 50, 60 years saw the impact of racial discrimination in Britain at first hand, prejudice, and it's part of my makeup. I feel passionately about it. I'm committed to improving the way we are, and I know my colleagues are. So I hope you'll take some reassurance from that.
Thank you. We're going to move on to another question. As automation increases, more jobs are put at risk. Could introducing universal basic income be an effective way of ensuring financial stability for all households?
Yeah, I think they're actually different issues, and I'm a bit puzzled the way they tend to get conflated. I mean, the issue about how the combination of AI and robotics could influence jobs is profoundly important and difficult. I'm actually reasonably optimistic about it, because if you look back historically, whenever there has been a major leap forward technologically, whether it was the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution and factory work, and then the computer revolution in the 60s, there were lots of people who went around saying this is the end of work. And of course it wasn't. Work evolved in a different way. So I'm not fundamentally pessimistic. It will be difficult because the speed of change is substantially greater than it has been in the past. What is potentially worrying is that it's I think not so much that it is going to cause mass unemployment. I think that's wildly unlikely, but that it potentially creates even bigger divisions, because what will happen is there will be plenty of job opportunities for people with advanced qualifications, for highly specialist skills, for creativity, people who are entrepreneurial and adaptable. Those people will clean up. And there will be plenty of jobs for people at the bottom doing casual manual work in the services sector. But what could be stripped out are what are currently fairly solid professional jobs in medicine, the legal profession, accounting, and so on, as these things are reduced to algorithms. I think the way we have to deal with it is, I don't think through universal income, I'll come to that in a minute, I think is by really focusing on adult education, training and retraining. I mean, we often say this at conferences, and frankly, Britain is very bad at it. We've allowed adult education to atrophy. Skills, certainly when I was in the coalition, we made a big push to get apprenticeships and skill training advanced. It's now being completely screwed up by this apprenticeship levy. But that has got to be the focus, how you help people skill and reskill again as the technology changes. But as far as universal income is concerned, I hope somebody will do a seminar for me or something and explain what this idea is going to contribute. I mean, it does seem to me an attempt to provide a simple solution to very complex problems. I mean, the simple truth of it, the benefit system is complicated because the world is complicated. And if you just have one standard universal income, how do you take account of the enormous variety of household rents, which vary from one town to another, from one street to another? The housing benefit system, which is unbelievably complicated, barely struggles to capture this. How are standardized payments going to do it? Goodness only knows. I mean, one of the things that struck me this afternoon, I did a tour of the exhibition, and there are people from the Southport Food Bank. I'd encourage you to stop and talk to them, because I was staggered to discover that in this town, which is 10,000 people, they've had 20,000 people coming for help. And a lot of that is a result of the introduction of universal credit. And universal credit, in many ways, is a mini version of the universal income. It is an attempt to standardize and simplify the benefit system. Of course, it's been done in a very crass and inhumane way, and you have this 8-week delay, but in some ways it comes from this wish which, you know, neat-minded people have to make everything simpler. But the problem with simplification is it takes no account of the vast variety of human conditions, the fact that if you're, for example, disabled, there's a whole level, different levels of disability, different special needs, and trying to reduce everything to a simple formula does not capture that. So I may be getting this all wrong, I may be missing something, but if somebody can explain to me what universal basic income does, which we're not getting at the moment, what's the question it's designed to answer, I'm all ears, but I haven't heard it yet.
Thank you. I should have said that question was from Stephen Ashton, who's a local member here in Southport. I will come to a supplementary from him if he wants shortly, but as I didn't give him any warning, whilst he makes his way to the mic, I'll take... don't have a supplementary. Fine. Okay. Thank you very much.
Anyway, thank you for the question.
Yeah. And so I'm going to take a couple of questions now from the auditorium, and I'm just looking quite carefully. Yes, thank you very much. Lady there, thank you.
Daphne Rose, I live near Malton. I am all in favour of a true and meaningful vote at the end of the, I hate the word, Brexit debates and discussions and when we know what the deal is. However, my greatest fear, if we're going for a referendum, is how do we ensure that the press play fair and that we don't get these appalling, one-sided, distorted headlines that we see in papers like The Mail, The Sun, and The Mirror? How do we ensure that the public genuinely are told the facts and not the fiction?
Well, the simple answer is we can't be sure, and we know that the press will not be fair. That's the useful starting point. There's no point imagining that the world will suddenly become a nicer place to help us win a vote on the final deal. But we've got, first of all, we've got to get the vote, and we're the only party at the moment pressing for one. The Labour Party are not in favour of it, the Tories are not in favour of it, so we've got a lot of work to do to get to that point. I think we will get to that point. We've got to win that argument. But having won that argument, we've then got to win the debate in the country. And I think, you know, whatever the Daily Express headlines may be, I think certain brutal truths are now coming through. The first is that we will be worse off by leaving. Even the Prime Minister, who is trying to make the Brexit case to the country, last week had to acknowledge that for the first time, quite explicitly, that we will lose access to markets, we will be worse off. It is now about damage limitation. I think psychologically that's quite an important moment. I think most people who have been captured by this argument that one of the great merits of Brexit is that we can go out and negotiate lots of trade deals. I mean, you can see the utter absurdity of that in an environment where Trump and others are embarking on trade warfare. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. And I think gradually the arguments are beginning to get through. But, you know, we can't take this for granted. We are going to have to win the argument. The press will not be on our side. And so the argument, you've got to find a way around it. We've got to use our own campaigning. You know, we've got 100,000 members, keen, energetic, almost entirely anti-Brexit. There is a growing coherence in the anti-Brexit movement. I work with people in other parties, with the various campaigning groups. They are beginning to get their act together. It wasn't always straightforward until 2 or 3 months ago. It was a bit like the Monty Python sketch about the People's Liberation Front of Judea fighting the Judea Liberation Front kind of thing. But there is more coherence, cohesiveness, more organization. And I think we're in a much, much better position to argue the case than in the referendum. And don't forget, that in the referendum, it was essentially a Cameron-Osborne team effort. And of course, all the baggage that was associated with them and with the Tory government was one of the things that dragged it down. So I think we have learnt from our mistakes. We're better organised. We shouldn't be neurotic and expect the press will suddenly come on board and be nice to us. They're not going to be.
Thank you. Going to look, there's the lady there in the white T-shirt. Yes, that's in the middle there. Yep, thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Hannah Hunter from Oxford West and Abingdon. I'm concerned with Brexit making a big smokescreen over environmental issues at the moment, and I also am worried to the extent to which this conference seems to have buried it under the rug a bit. We saw with the plastic bag tax that our party, as small as it may be, can have a huge impact on environmental concerns, and there is a big window for us there. What do you think is next for the Liberal Democrats in terms of our environmental policy?
Well, sorry. No, I mean, thank you for asking the question. It matters. Your premise is absolutely right. The environment is a massive issue. It has disappeared from the headlines. But I don't agree with your point that Brexit is a smokescreen, because the whole point about opposing Brexit is that we're defending the principle of countries working together on shared problems. And if you deal with climate change, or for that matter, pollution of the oceans by plastic, you can only deal with it through countries collaborating, as we do very effectively within the European Union. And the real damage that Brexit's doing is that it's bringing a revival of old-fashioned nationalism and divisiveness. And if countries are nationalistic, there is no way that you can possibly deal with cross-border pollution problems like climate change. And it's no surprise to me that groups like UKIP, that were very pro-Brexit, are also at the forefront of the climate change denial movement, and their friends on the Tory right are in the same position. So, you're right to remind us, environment is one of our USPs. We've got to be big about it, strong about it, continue to be radical. Climate change is very much at the centre of all that. But to my mind, it sits very comfortably with our opposition to Brexit. They're not in opposition to each other.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question we've had submitted in advance. This is from Finn Conway. So Finn wants to know, given your age, how do we reconcile the need to energise and engage with the younger generation?
Yes, well, I tried to suppress my irritation when I get the question posed in that way, but no, I shouldn't. No, I think I mean, if you think about the politicians who have managed to engage the younger generation politically in the recent years, actually people of my generation, people like Bernie Sanders in America, I don't feel in any way estranged by the fact that I'm that generation. I have children, I have grandchildren, I'm in touch. I think what we have to do is to engage with, first of all, with the issues that young people are primarily concerned about, and then communicate with them in a way that they can understand. I mean, in terms of issues, I think we had a very good illustration this morning with Layla's introduction to that debate on education, that we want education to be our #1 issue. We have always been the party of education. We should be and should continue to be. One of the things I'm trying to do is to focus on the appalling inequities in the housing market, where young people have no prospect whatever of the option of home ownership until their 40s, unless they have the bank of mum and dad. So we've got to have a radical approach to house building. But in terms of how you actually communicate, I mean, I'm not personally brilliant in the use of social media, but at least I know what I don't know. And I do accept, and indeed I'm actively promoting the idea that we've got to leapfrog our competitors. You know, the Labour Party became very good at social media. We've got to get one step better. And if you look at some of our sister parties like the Canadian Liberals, who jumped from 4th to 1st, how they did it was by mastering social media. And we've got to do the same. So that's how I think we engage. And just one final point. Some of you will have attended the consultative session on university fees and graduate tax, which David Howarth has done work for us. I mean, I'm not apologetic about what we did in government, but it is a difficult issue with a lot of young people, and I think we just got to face up to it and deal with it, and I think that's what we're now doing. What I am encountering, however, I go around a lot of universities. I think we're actually very warmly received for the most part. Some of the university meetings I've attended have been attended by hundreds of people. There's one stuck out particularly in my mind. I went to Newcastle, where we hadn't had a student society for years, and the handful of Lib Dems had more or less taken the view that, you know, we should write off the university, but they convened a meeting. I was asked if I would go when I was in the city. I was told, well, you'll get 20 people. Actually, over 200 people turned up, and, you know, they're very keen to help. I was greatly encouraged by the first question I had, which was from a young man who said, I've just left the Labour Party. I thought Jeremy Corbyn was too right-wing. So that's...
Finn, do you have a supplementary? I can't see the mic. No. So we'll take a couple of questions from the auditorium. So, has there anyone got? So, let's see. So we've got a gentleman there in the white shirt.
Lack of gender balance here, I think.
They're trying to attract your attention up there as well.
Yep, no, I will come to up there as well.
Richard Flowers from Cheadle. How do we get Leveson 2?
Well, the government have just, of course, rejected it. I think, actually, the revelations of a few days ago that the bad practices in the Murdoch press have just been exposed as much worse and more long-lasting than previously been understood, have perhaps reopened that question. I think we should be very committed to the idea that if we're in a position of power, we want to have those issues properly examined. I have a certain, declaration of interest in this area, as you probably know. After I said rude things about Mr. Murdoch and his empire, I had 6 months, I discovered subsequently, of having all my bins turned over, and we now know roughly where it came from. So these practices have been going on pretty much till probably about 5 years ago, up till pretty much the Leveson report. I did give evidence to the Leveson inquiry because of my own involvement in it, and argued very strongly for the continuation of his work in that area. And I think you'll find that the things we're saying in Parliament, Christine Jardine is leading for us, are very consistent with what you're asking.
Thank you. And gentleman over there.
Wish I could do so little to get applause normally. Just following on from the question of university tuition fees and what they've done to us on the doorstep, could I just ask if you could say something in favour of a double system of learning accounts, one for 16 or 18 plus students, and another you can carry through the rest of your life for training purposes? I do hope there's a possibility. Thank you, Vince.
Well, it is, and those of you who were at the autumn conference will know I spoke about this and I advocated it. I don't want to anticipate too much of what I'm going to say tomorrow morning, but actually we now have a group led by an educator who I work with quite closely in government from the Open University, looking in detail about how this kind of learning account will work. One of the things that I would emphasize is, although this is partly a response to the whole tuition fee issue, we've got to remember that 60% of young people don't go to university. And if we're going to do something for university students, we should treat other young people on a comparable basis. One of the best things I did in my 2 years of exile from Parliament, I worked with the National Union of Students. They took me on as a kind of unpaid consultant. And I worked with the General Secretary, somebody called Shakira Martin, who was head of a students' union, had never been to university. She had been through the FE system. And she was constantly reminding everybody that's where the majority of students actually are. And we produced quite an influential report on how we can give not just parity of esteem, but parity of practical financial help to people in the FE and the university sector. So I think on the learning accounts, watch this space. I do want that to be a central feature of what we are arguing going forward.
Time for one more very quick question. Just trying to see. You have to excuse me, the light, because the angle of the lighting, it's very difficult to see. So there's a person there at the back, yes, with you there. You want to stand up? Yeah, thank you very much.
It's a shortage of applicants for training in nursing, science, mathematics, etc., a reflection of the perceived difficulty of these courses, the pay, or is it some other reason?
No, as I understand it, there is quite a big increase in the number of people doing mathematics and physics, and what is also very important is gender diversity, because we've had this traditional stereotyping in the past of girls doing arts-related and boys doing science engineering, and I hope and I think that is breaking down. But the ugly truth, however, is that Britain is way, way down the international rankings when you look at mathematical capability. I think we're way below quite a lot of Asian countries as well as Northern Europe, and it's an area where there has to be a lot more emphasis in curriculum, giving support for teachers who want to upgrade their maths qualifications. What very often happens is that in primary schools, the people who are teaching maths don't have a maths qualification, and clearly that's got to be addressed very substantially.
Thank you. We've almost come to the end of the time we've got available. One last question for you. It's from Kieran Makota, but I apologise to Kieran, he's not going to get a chance for a supplementary. So you're just going to get Kieran's question. What is your favourite biscuit? I just read the questions.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's a subject which is actually quite close to my heart, and I'll explain why. And my answer is Kit Kat. And there are two reasons for that. One is that my parents started their lives on the production lines in Rantries and Terrys in York. And of course, Kit Kat was the most famous product of that industry. And the other was when I started life as a parliamentary candidate in York in the 80s. I stood twice for our cause. And I was struggling, as candidates often do, to find a serious issue to really cut through into the local media. And all the usual stuff about, the economy and social standard, all the rest. Nobody was listening. But the issue I fastened onto was the fact that Kit Kat was classified as chocolate rather than a biscuit, and therefore was taxed with value-added tax. And when I campaigned for the exemption of Kit Kat from value-added tax, I became a local hero, and I wouldn't say it won me the seat, because it didn't, but it made a difference. So I've got a clear preference.
Fine. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the conference attendees, can I thank you for coming and answering these questions? And I know I've said this in the past, but I really do feel that only at a Liberal Democrat conference would you get the party leader coming, answering a series of random questions, both submitted in advance from the auditorium and putting themselves through this. So we really appreciate it, so thank you very much. Can I just also, as well as Vince, thank my aides, Jenny Lang and Chris Mains, and it's now my pleasure to hand over to the chair of the next session. Thank you all very much. Okay.
Now, I see a problem, and that's the right to buy legislation. Council houses become second homes. Now, I see a problem, and that's the right to buy legislation. Council houses become second homes.
Whether that's directly through, for instance, air pollution and water pollution. And a policy which seeks to deal with that separately is out of date. We're talking in this conference, in this motion as amended, about farm policy, not specifically anymore the common agricultural policy. Now, whether it is something we can do together with our colleagues elsewhere in Europe, as we've sought to do, we've sought to lead reforms on the CAP for well over 35 years that I'm aware of, and some of you in the audience may have even longer memories. We need to continue that process, whether we're in Europe, in the EU, or whether we're outside it, talking about a British agricultural policy and a devolved agricultural policy. Well, what do we need to do? Let's recognise the perverse and inefficient nature of our current agricultural policy. The fact is that about £3 billion per annum is paid out in farm support, and because most of that is not related to the environment, it's farm income support, and it is paid in proportion to the amount of land that you farm. Inevitably, a disproportionate amount of it goes to the largest farmers, as Phil Bennion has referred to. So we need to have a more efficient policy and one which takes account of the social and environmental costs of farming and delivers public benefits from public money. Very difficult to say that is something that is achieved by the current policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Cara Jenkinson to stand by, please?
Of ethnicity and culture, of how the party handles race. And actually, that is going to be the major piece of work going forward for myself and most members of the board. When we meet at our away day in a couple of weeks' time, it's the bulk of the discussion, is how we can make sure that John's report gets to every single part of the party, because, as Vince said, this isn't just about Vince as leader and me as president. The federal finance report, which comes immediately after the board one, gives you the forecast figures for the 2018 budget. obviously after not just a general election year when things are always tight, but after a general election year in 2015, a referendum year in 2016, and then a general election year in 2017, like other political parties, funding is tight for the coming year, but it looks as if we can make things balance. And then finally, we talk in our report about Your Liberal Britain, or rather the People's Development Committee does. I won't say much more about that because there are lots of questions up, but actually it's an interesting, innovative piece of work, and I hope that in the response to the questions we can certainly allay some of the queries. Thank you.
Thanks, Sal. We've received a number of questions to this report, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So they can be found on page 14 of the conference daily. I'm not going to read out all the questions, but if each questioner will have the opportunity to ask a supplementary question as well. So if you are planning to ask a supplementary question, can you make sure that you're at the intervention mic? So the first question is from Alistair Calder-McGregor, and I'll ask Sal to respond, please.
Yes, this is on page 14, the questions, if you can't see them. So my response is, for A, the project team working on ensuring the party's compliance with GDPR is continuing to carry out its work, and it shouldn't have any effect on leadership elections other than the arrangements we will make for membership data. On B, we attempted to avoid the disparity by holding a series of town hall meetings across the country in place of the leadership hustings to make sure that all our members had the chance to hear Vince, have their say and ask him questions. We're very firmly of the view that reopen nominations, or RON, is not an option in these circumstances. Just think about how it would look to the press if we had anybody voting against the appointment of a leader, and even worse, if that person were then not elected. And I think, actually, if there are real concerns, I mean, the problem this time, as you will know, is Vince was the only candidate. On C, I think, Alistair, you're referring here to the federal committee elections, because that's the only ones that we were allowed to take diversity arrangements for. We obviously can't do it for a one-winner-takes-all post like the leader or president. The diversity measures in the committee elections worked well this time. Just to remind you, it's 40% female members, 10% disabled, 10% ethnic minority, and 10% LGBT+. There was only one committee where any adjustment needed to be made. I'm incredibly proud of you as members, because you, actually having been aware of that, voted for diverse membership of the committees.
Thanks, Sal. Alistair, do you wish to ask a supplementary question?
Supplementary on point A, with the GDPR regulations coming into force very soon, will that measure be in place across the entire party, and is that sufficiently progressed at this point?
I'm one of the people that receives regular updates, and because there's a sort of overarching theme, it cuts across a lot of committees, it's also coming back to the federal board. And the answer is, yes, it is, but we're in your hands to do that, because we need your responses, the audits we sent out to local parties. A lot of them have come in, but not all. There are other arrangements that are coming in as well about, there's been queries about software that you can use under the new systems, and all that information is about to come out. Yes, it is, and we're talking to, obviously, to key people like ALDC and other bodies as well who hold data.
The second question is from Michael Meadowcroft. So.
The general election review for 2017, as indeed for other general election reviews, never goes into specific cases, and it doesn't actually ever comment on discipline cases either, nor indeed can the federal board respond to queries about a particular discipline case.
Thanks, Sal. Michael, would you like to ask a supplementary question?
Can I then ask, how will this colleague of long-standing City Councillor and a former Member of Parliament in Bradford East, who 10 months after the event was sacked without appeal and has never been given the reasons for his sacking, when will he get some answers as to why he was sacked?
I'm afraid I can't answer that, because the federal party is not responsible for discipline. Michael, your best bet is to write to the chair of the Regional Parties Committee of the English party, because they are the ones that dealt with it and will deal with any future issues as well, like responding to your queries.
The third question is from Spencer Haggard. Sal, please can you respond?
Yes, thanks, Spencer. The Federal Board, the Federal People Development Committee and Federal Communications and Elections Committee have all had strategy sessions that have involved some different types of scenario planning. And this occurred when we were planning for the snap election, before it, and it's happened again after it, whether it's for another snap election or a referendum. This was also key to the process in arriving at our party strategy. I'm sure that such scenario planning will continue to take place, not least as we move towards the next election, be it 12 months or even 4 years' time, or actually 3 months.
Thank you. Spencer, do you have a supplementary? No. The fourth question is from Alistair Calder-McGregor again. Sal?
Data is provided to Your Liberal Britain only when they are undertaking a project as a service for the party. And as agreed at the Federal Board meeting in September last year, such data is provided on an as-needed basis as long as it is within the terms of a project-specific data sharing agreement, which has to be approved at HQ by the compliance team.
Thank you. Alistair?
Can I ask on what projects Your Liberal Britain is then working currently for the Federal Party?
They are working with some new members. They're doing a lot of digital work at the moment. They've got a champions group on Facebook. And, of course, you may recently have seen, and if you haven't seen, go to their stall, their Paddy Ashdown Prize.
The fifth question is from Alistair Calder-McGregor. Sal, can I ask you to respond?
So Your Liberal Britain successfully sourced a £10,000 donation from Rumi Verji in the summer of 27, and Rumi wanted it channeled through the party. This was declared at the time. If you look at the party donations, you will find it there, and it's a matter of public record. Rumi provided that sum to the Liberal Democrats and asked us to pass it on to Your Liberal Britain. They have themselves raised further money, but not through the party.
Thank you. Alistair, do you have a supplementary question on that?
I'm just asking if I could have an answer to the second part of this, the objectives and success failure metrics.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. Yes, of course. I referred in the previous question to an agreement, and there are metrics in that, and those metrics are being monitored by the Federal People Development Committee.
Thank you.
Question 6 is from Jenny Rigg. Sal, please can you respond?
Yes, HQ passes are given to a variety of different organisations associated with the Lib Dems, as well as to certain key volunteers. And I understand Your Liberal Britain is in the process of drafting a So, for example, I have a pass, but I'm not a staff member. But there are also key volunteers and other committee chairs who have it. I understand that Your Liberal Britain is in the process of drafting a constitution and forming its own executive committee, as per the agreement made with the Federal Board in September, because he wanted it to become a constituted organisation. Whether it goes on to become an AO or an SAO, that's not at this stage important. What we wanted was a body that was accountable in some way. The Federal Board does have a number of powers over Your Liberal Britain, including over the provision of HQ passes, desk space, data, etc. And we commissioned them to carry out certain work for the party, some of which I've just referred to earlier, which is part of the agreement, and we'll reassess this autumn whether this has represented good value for money. At that point, if we are not satisfied, we can halt the arrangement, or we can find a way of making it continue.
Thank you. Jenny, do you have a supplementary question?
So, your mention of the accountability of the group, can you go into more detail about what those accountability measures are? Because they're not massively obvious.
I think I can't in this particular session, but the Federal Board saw a draft plan. The actual final accountability was signed off by the Chief Executive after concerns that we'd raised to make them harder and clearer. And it's that form that's now with the People Development Committee. If you look at the People Development Committee report, they refer to work beginning that process of holding them to account.
Question 7 is also from Jenny Rigg. Sal, your response?
I think I've already covered part of this. which is where the £10,000 donation came from. It was from a specific donor that wanted to channel it through the party. The second part of the question, how can SAOs access similar levels of financial support from HQ? Well, Your Liberal Britain did what many local parties do, and I am delighted that more SAOs and AOs are doing it, which is to get the financial support training to go out and find and get fundraising support, and then as a result of that, bring money in.
You missed one.
Oh.
Sorry, you've answered question 8 instead of question 7. It was a good answer, though. I'm very satisfied with it.
Jenny, there are so many questions from you. It's easy to get confused. Okay, so this one is easy.
So just to clarify, this is question 7.
So sorry, I'm going back to question 7. This is feeling like that mastermind comedy where you answer the question before last. So I'm sorry, Jenny. Any SAO which wishes to promote an initiative can do the same as Your Liberal Britain did and proactively ask myself, Vince, key party members to take part in those initiatives. And as you know, I did a piece on Lib Dem Voice about trans rights a few weeks ago. They can also approach HQ staff, as Your Liberal Britain did, and request support for communicating those initiatives to members. The only thing you need to be aware of, there is a very complex communications plan, so it's not something that you can say on a Friday, can we have an all-member mailing out on Monday? It needs to be well planned. So speaking for myself, and I suspect, for Vince, if there are initiatives like this, that I will absolutely support them, and I'm happy to provide the same support as I have for Your Liberal Britain.
Thank you.
Any supplementary? No. Okay. We'll move on to question 9 now, which is from Theo but Philip. Sal, your response?
Peter Dunphy is going to come and respond to that because it's technically a Finance Committee question. It also gives me a chance to have a glass of water.
Okay, so thanks for the question. So this is in relation to the budget and the campaign for gender balance. So firstly, looking at the budget that we've adopted for 2018 is very much a follow-on from 2017 with, unfortunately, a freeze in relation to expenditure. 2017, with the general election, the unexpected general election, was very tough on our finances. We always see a fall-off on funding, particularly from the larger donors, in the immediate aftermath of general elections, and it then sort of recovers as part of the electoral cycle. So we've had to be very tight and strict with our budgeting for 2018, and within that, there hasn't been the capacity to make any increases. That takes me on to the campaign for gender balance. It does appear, reading the question, that there may have been a cut, whereas in fact there hasn't been a specific budget for the campaign for gender balance for a number of years now. Now, what the campaign did have was a hypothecated donation in relation to their specific activities. We just heard how that's happened in relation to Your Liberal Britain. And certainly going forward, it's very much part of the strategy of the party to look at these additional strands of funding for specific things, rather than looking to the federal party as a sort of grant-giving organisation. So that would be probably the best route in terms of that particular campaign seeking funding. As well, indeed, it would apply to our new campaign in relation to ethnic diversity. And just finally, I'd like to pay credit to the Campaign for Gender Balance, who have actually done remarkable work over the last few years without a budget.
I can't see Theo at the intervention.
Oh,
there he is.
Hang on, Pete.
Theo, would you like to ask a supplementary question?
Yeah. Firstly, when was the last time that there was indeed a hypothecated donation for the Campaign for Gender Balance, if that's no longer the case? And secondly, given the very clear decision by conference in 2005 to request the federal executive, as it then was, to ensure that the Campaign for Gender Balance is adequately resourced, what is the federal board and the federal the Finance Committee doing to ensure that?
Okay, well, the first part of the question, I don't know exactly what year that was. I only got notice of this question about a couple of hours ago. But it's certainly not been in the budget for the last few years. And I say the reason for that is because it was a hypothecated donation rather than a recurring budgeted item of the federal party. In terms of what the federal board can do is, as mentioned in answering the main question, I think we do really need to look at additional streams of funding and revenue where we have these specific campaigns. It's very difficult for us to simply allocate funds when we're having to make significant savings in other areas. And there's obviously numerous calls for additional expenditure. You know, we've heard Vince wants additional expenditure, quite rightly, in terms of what we do digitally. And so what we have to do is support these campaigns through volunteer help, through advice, through facilitation, introduction to key donors. And I think that is the way forward, rather than relying on the assumption that the party has a big pot of money that it can just divide up amongst the causes that we support.
Thank you very much. The final question, number 10, is also from Theo but Philip. Can I call James Girling, who's going to respond as chair of the Campaigns and Elections Committee?
Hello, everybody. I'm answering this question because whilst it is the job of the Gender Balance Task Force to provide capacity to fill the pipeline, if you like, with female candidates, it's the FCEC job to report those figures, and we do so as part of the committee called the Joint States Candidates Committee that feeds in from the relevant states how we're doing in terms of candidate selection. So your question about whether or not we should report those figures in our federal board report or indeed in the FCEC report is well made. And where that is, where that's possible, and to our in interest of transparency, we could happy to do so and provide those figures change on change, conference to conference. There's an element as to whether or not that's useful data, and says a great deal more than what the change is between one conference and one conference. So we've just had those figures reported at this conference in a joint meeting with the JSCC. I think therefore, I think some of the details that you've asked for, we have always put the detail. We were asked to do this by the EHRC, and they recommended that political parties put these on some of these details on their websites, and we've done so for a number of years, and we're one of the not all political parties have done so. And if you want to, you can go to www.libdems.org.uk/candidate_diversity, and you'll find the details there. That doesn't help you in terms of the immediate question about how we've reported those at the moment, I understand. Interestingly, in terms of some of the specifics you've asked, the percentage of women on list of approved Westminster candidates at present is around 28% and hasn't changed. Interestingly, you'll see on that that 7% BAME candidates, 10% are LGBT plus candidates, and 9% are disabled. So you'll see there are lots of other areas as well that we're interested in and that we're monitoring and wish to perform better on. In terms of the question you raised in terms of women applying, which is a very useful indice to look at indeed. Currently, that's about 19% in the system, and that compares to 3% BAME, 11% LGBT+, and 9% disabled. As I say, more detail can be found in future reports, and we'd be happy to do so.
Thank you, James. Theo, do you have a supplementary question?
Yeah. I specifically asked for this to be included, whether this could be included in the Campaign for Gender Balance report, because I thought it would be helpful as part of that report to highlight what the situation is and remind us all of how much progress we may have made, but quite how much of a significant way to go there clearly is. But as the Federal Board is answering it, in spring 2016, we passed a motion called Electing Diverse MPs, where we asked the Federal Executive to report to conference, including an update on the work of the Campaign for Candidate Diversity Task Force in each of its reports. I don't see that in the report. Could there be some explanation for why not?
Because they do represent. the next report is from the Campaign for Gender Balance. They do report regularly to conference as part of this setup. I mean, there's no desire to sort of resile from the figures or the targets that we've set. Key to this is increasing our parliamentary representation at all levels, and with increases in those at that level, we will have success. We showed that that's possible in Scotland, where we had 50% of the increase in MPs were women, and we've 50% of the target seat candidates in Wales were women. These are not enough, and there is no complacency on behalf of anybody, let alone the Federal Board, and certainly not within the Campaign for Gender Balance.
Thank you, James. We'll now vote on whether to accept the report. Can I please see those that are in favour of accepting the report? Okay, and can I see those against? I think just one. Yeah, just one, I think. So thank you very much, conference. Can I also thank all those that submitted questions, and also Sal, Matthew and James for replying. Conference will now move on to item F11, which is the report from the Campaign for Gender Balance. I'll now ask Julia Cambridge, on behalf of the Campaign for Gender Balance, to present the report.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Julia Cambridge. I'm the Vice Chair of the Campaign for Gender Balance, and I'm here to present our report on behalf of Candy Piercy, our Chair, myself, and Helena Cole, my co-Vice Chair. So, the Campaign for Gender Balance has had a busy 6 months since Federal Conference. We've worked hard with the help of Lib Dem HQ Diversity Team and the Candidates Office to support women applying for both selection and approval. We've recruited a team of over 30 people willing to commit significant time and effort to mentoring and supporting women candidates in the Lib Dems. Now, we're looking for more mentors at the moment to work alongside people, but also to commit with doing things like design a selection literature. Now, the rush is on for target seat selections, and our selection mentors are working very hard. We try to provide individual mentors for any woman applying for a target seat who is shortlisted. Now, CGB is renowned within the party for the quality of training we offer to women. However, we only ran 7 training modules at Federal Conference because of the lack of training slots, a massive drop on 2007 when we ran 32 workshops. Half of the 2007 workshops were open to all comers and were vital as part of our mission to improve the culture in the party in order to make it more open and welcoming to women. Now, sadly, we no longer have access to as many training rooms at conference. However, in this conference, Southport Conference, I'm glad to say we have 4 training slots, which is a good proportion and better than last autumn. So I need to give thanks to Dan Purchase and Rachel Palmer-Randall for helping us get those slots. We are working with the diversity team and the Federal People's Development Committee to make our CGB training material available to help underrepresented groups within the Lib Dems. Now, the Morrissey report highlighted the need for more training for women. However, we've gone backwards in this respect as regards conference. We've also gone backwards in terms of budget. We had a budget of around £30,000 per annum when we were first set up. Things are very different now. We have no dedicated budget from the party. We have limited staff support, but we do have help from the excellent and hard-working Natalie Chindippa, part of her diversity remit. And we can bid for limited funds from the diversity team budget. Now, the diversity teams were able to give us sufficient funds and staff time to run the Future Women's MP Weekend training workshop, and that happened and was completed this February. It was a massive success. However, they were only able to give us enough money to financially support 17 delegates. And this is on a course which is designed for 25. Now, when applications closed, we had 76. So, CGB Chair Candy Pearcey launched an appeal, which raised over £3,000. This was enough to pay for 8 extra places for the February one just gone, and to hopefully go towards the second weekend in May. We recognise that the admin for the weekend will need to be done by CGB volunteers, as Natalie will have other priorities. So, if more money comes in, we hope to run a third Future Women MP weekend in the autumn. We also hope to work with Scotland, Wales and the English regions to offer CGB Inspiration Days as widely as possible. The Inspiration Days, for those of you that don't know, are aimed at new members and encourage women to stand for council as well as Parliament. A few thanks now. We would like to thank all the donors who have made things possible, and to thank again Rachel Palmer-Randall, Director of People, Darren Briddock from the Compliance Department, and Topi, Head of Finance, for their swift help to make sure that we were legally compliant in the way that we handled our donations. We know that federal funds are always tight after a general election. But CGB was set up with a commitment that it should be properly resourced. We intend to campaign for appropriate financial support from the party in the future. But for the moment, we are more grateful than words can say to our donors for how they have helped us. Now, our hope is that we can again help women as talented as Jo Swinson, Christine Jardine, Vera Hobhouse and Layla Moran to set out on their journey to success and winning a seat in Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. We've received one question to this report. Can I ask Theo but Philip? Julia, would you like to respond to the question from Theo?
Okay. Well, I know Theo was here earlier, and I want to thank him for his question, which I have discussed with Helena and Candy. So, yes, if we go back to 2015, we had women in target and previously held seats to the sort of percentage of 50%. But we were resourced then. The hard work that went into making that happen was under a good financial umbrella. We haven't set targets, as Theo asks, at the moment, and we are hopeful that we can get back to the level of resources that we were when we did have 50% in target and previously held seats.
Thank you. Theo, do you have a supplementary question?
Yeah. Given that the Campaign for Gender Balance does not receive a dedicated budget from the Central Party, and that we still have only the last election where we had our highest number of female candidates ever, we still had fewer than 200, fewer than 30% of our candidates for the general election across the country were women. Do you think the party centrally is taking the need to address gender balance seriously enough?
Thank you, Theo. I think there is a lot of goodwill in the party, and I think there is a lot of hard work, and I think there is a lot of intent. But those things don't account for tangible money on the ground. Yes, I think we have heard with the speaker before, James Girling, that things are obviously stretched. We had this snap election budget sprung on us. But my job is not to explain away such things. I feel we do need more resources. We need resources, yes, we need to go out, we need to fundraise, we need to get donors. But women don't get there by accident. They need proper, we do need training. We do need encouragement. We do need the inspiration days. We do need the Future Women MP weekends, and they cost money. So the short answer to your question is no.
Thank you. We will now vote on whether to accept this report. Can I please see all those in favour? And those against? I think that's unanimous. Thank you very much, Conference, and thank you, Julia. I'd like to thank my aides, Mary Reid and James Girling, and I'll now hand over to Jeff Payne, who will be chairing the next item.
Well, good afternoon, Conference. We now move on in the dying embers of Saturday to a couple of constitutional items. The first of those is F12, the General Data Protection Regulations, Implementation and Risk Management. Would Helena Cole please stand by? And I now call Peter Dunphy, who is Chair of the Federal Finance and Resources Committee, to move this constitutional amendment. You'll find it at page 48 of the agenda.
Thanks very much. So there's two quite distinct parts to this constitutional amendments, should say, really. The first relates to GDPR, and I'm sure that everybody has heard of GDPR, and I'm sure that everybody also wishes that they knew more about exactly what the implications of it are. The good news is that there are training sessions taking place at this conference in relation to GDPR. There was 2 today, and there is another one scheduled for tomorrow morning, and I'd very much recommend those, particularly for those of you who are party officers. Now, with this new legislation coming in, it's been required for us to make a fairly obvious constitutional amendment to update what we require of local parties, and phasing out the old Data Protection Act references and bringing in GDPR references. So that's the first part of the constitutional amendments. The second part is in relation to a change that is being proposed by the FFRC, the Finance and Resources Committee, the Federal Board, and indeed the new Audit and Scrutiny Committee. And this is very much following on from the governance review that we passed last year. And I would really describe this as a tightening up exercise in relation to the governance review to meet the objectives that we see appropriate. And there's 2 changes that are being proposed here, one of which is in relation to compliance, and this includes GDPR, but also, very importantly for us, includes electoral compliance, preparer, and relations with the Electoral Commission. And the proposal is that that compliance function should now sit under the Finance and Resources Committee. We feel that that's highly logical in that it's very much a day-to-day management function for the party, and indeed the chair of the FFRC, which is currently myself, is automatically appointed as the registered party treasurer and therefore responsible for signing off Electoral Commission reports and donation returns on a quarterly basis and liaising with the Electoral Commission. So it seems appropriate that the committee that is chaired by the registered party treasurer should indeed be the committee that is responsible for compliance. The other side of that is that under the old constitution, we had a problem in relation to where exactly risk management sat, and in particular looking at the risk register in a meaningful and regular basis. The intention has been for that to go to the Audit and Scrutiny Committee, but that wasn't actually followed through in terms of the Governance Review constitutional amendments last year. So we're doing that now. And we very much feel that looking at and scrutinising risk is a fairly clear function of our Audit and Scrutiny Committee. So the constitutional amendments put compliance where we feel that should appropriately go, and put risk management where we feel that more appropriately should go. And so I hope you will all be happy to support those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I've got no cards in against this at all, so Sal Brinton has said she's going to waive her summation. But I do have a card for the motion, which is from Helena Cole of Portsmouth. She wishes to speak for the motion as a whole on lines 16 to 23. So I'll call her now. Helena.
Good afternoon, Conference. I'm speaking as the Chair of the Federal Audit and Scrutiny Committee. Many of you won't really know very much about us, but we are appointed by Federal Board. We are asked to apply, and we are asked to apply with CVs. Most of us are qualified in some way to be on this committee. I am a qualified accountant. I work in a senior finance position in a multinational organisation. I regularly scrutinise risk registers as part of my normal job, and I wanted to speak in favour of this motion because actually I really think somebody needs to be spending a lot of time looking at the risk register. It's really important for us as a party, and I think we are the most qualified place for that to sit. But as nobody's offered to speak against it, probably will go through, but please vote in favour of this.
Thank you very much. Right, we're now going to move to a vote on F12 as a constitutional amendment. This will require 2/3 of those voting to pass. Could I ask you please to hold your voting cards up when you vote with the word voting towards me? Can I see all those in favour of the constitutional amendment? Thank you. Can I see those against? Yeah, that's very clearly carried. Clearly achieved the relevant 2/3. Thank you very much. We are now going to move on to two further items, F13 and F14, reforming our party's disciplinary processes. You'll find those at page 51 of the agenda onwards. We are starting a little bit early on this, but there are a couple of things that I ought to say to you before the debate starts, so hopefully by the time we get there, it will have reached 5:05. You'll find this, as I say, at page 51 of the agenda. We do have a business motion and a constitutional amendment, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, if I may. There are some amendments to these, and they're at page 16 of Conference Daily onwards. You'll find to F13, the business motion, at page 16, there is an amendment moved by Margaret Joachim. To the constitutional amendment, F14, you'll find there are some drafting amendments that the Federal Conference Committee has agreed. You'll also find another amendment moved by Margaret Joachim. That is effectively on the same issue as the amendment to F13. You'll find also, if you look at page 18 of Conference Daily, that on F14 there will be a separate vote on lines 36 to 41. Lines 36 to 41. You'll find that in the agenda, as I say, and that is to do with the power of the Chief Executive to suspend a party member, 36 to 41 at page 55 of the agenda. Now, clearly this is a session about the party's disciplinary processes. It proposes a new one. You'll be voting on that. I would ask all speakers, given that there are a number of live disciplinary cases in the party at the moment, not to say anything that would jeopardise any of those or breach confidentiality in relation to any disciplinary processes live or past. I'm sure I don't need to explain why. The reasons are obvious. The session is listed in the agenda as two separate items. Now, the FCC thought long and hard about how that was going to work in practice, and what we've actually decided to do, given that the amendment to each of these, F13 and F14, relates to exactly the same thing, and given that the constitutional amendments relate to the business motion and the same issues, we thought we would run it as one session from start to finish. That will save us having to call Isabel Pasaram and Ken MacDonald twice to propose and summate. So what I propose to do is call them once, but give them the time they would have had had they been called twice, so they'll have effectively double the amount of time they would have for one speech. I hope that makes sense. It was simply because the cards in the debate related to all sorts of issues on both F13 and F14, and we thought it far more sensible to have a debate on the whole thing as opposed to having two separate ones that might become a bit artificial and bitty. I have received a request for a reference back. That is from Vanessa King from Guildford. I'll be taking that towards the end of the debate. So with that fairly long run up to the crease, I'm afraid, could I ask Margaret Joachim to stand by to move Amendment 1, and I now call Isabel Pasaram to propose the changes to the party's disciplinary processes. Isabel, you have 10 minutes for that for the people on the lights. Thank you.
In 1997, a young black youth camp director, Tarana Burke, was pulled aside for a private chat by a 13-year-old girl. Tarana knew what was coming, and she wanted to run. The girl began to describe horrific abuse perpetrated by her mother's boyfriend. Instead of embracing the girl's pain and giving her a voice, Tarana shut her down and referred her to someone else. Tarana says now, "I watched that girl walk away, take her secrets, tuck them back into their hiding place, put her mask back on, and walk back into the world, completely alone." Tortured by the memory of what she had done, Tarana went on to become a civil rights activist, and in 2006, she founded the Me Too movement. Now, in 2018, we have adopted Me Too. Me Too stands for all of those victims of sexual assault and harassment who have stood up and had the courage to say, "This is enough," and rightly so. But this is also an era of terrible miscarriages of justice. We've all heard about the case of Liam Payne, but there are many other cases, such as that of Isaac Itiari. Isaac is a young black father of 2 who was accused of repeated assault of a child. He spent 4 months in custody, and then it was disclosed through a series of messages that the young victim had deliberately posed as an adult. So not only had she participated in the acts, she had also initiated them. Isaac was just weeks away from trial. But why is any of this relevant to this motion today? As a barrister specialising in these issues, I was asked to conduct an investigation into the handling of sexual harassment complaints within the party. Although my investigation did involve interviews with those involved in complaints, my investigation focused more on process than individual cases. I then produced the Pasaram report containing recommendations that were fed into the MacDonald Review. And although my investigation focused on sexual impropriety, Lord MacDonald calls for changes across the entire spectrum of complaints handling. The call that Lord MacDonald is making has been echoed by many party members over the years, well before the Time's Up campaign and the Me Too campaign. And it is time for change. Our party is in the same position as many other organisations. However, those other organisations, many of them are still grappling with how to handle the crisis that they're facing. We are spearheading change. And this is an opportunity for us, not only to set an example to other organisations, but to bring positive change within our own party. We have a chance to make a real difference. Now, there may be some aspects of this motion that you don't agree with. For example, You might disagree with the resource required for training or the very tight timescales. However, we're an ambitious party. This motion has been years in the making. It's based on extensive consultation. And we're doing this because these changes are some of the most radical reforms of our Constitution in recent times, and we want to base this on robust scrutiny. And so we welcome the debate that will follow. We have to get this right, and we have to be fair to everyone involved in this process, including the people who are reporting misconduct, as well as those who are accused of it. We don't want anyone in this party saying that they feel that the system has failed them, or that the party has not supported them, or that they simply haven't been listened to. Our Constitution states that we oppose all forms of prejudice based on race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, colour, age, and disability, and that we oppose entrenched privilege and inequality. Let's put these values into motion by agreeing this motion and living out those values going forward in our processes. In the words of Barack Obama, change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the people that we've been waiting for, and we are the change that we seek. Conference, I urge you, be the change that we seek and vote in favour of this motion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Isabel. Would Leon Duveen from Bassett Law please stand by? And I now call Margaret Joachim, who is chair of the Regional Parties Committee, to move both of her amendments, the one to F13 and the one to F14, which involve the same issue. You've got 6 minutes for this, Margaret, for those who are doing the lights.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Conference, I would be the first to acknowledge that the system by which we currently execute our disciplinary process is in need of very considerable improvement. As some of you know, I have been working with it, trying to make it work for some time. We have struggled for years with inadequate support and inadequate resources to enable us to do a really good job. And the current system, of course, was set up and defined before the proliferation of social media, and it was not under the same pressure from sexual misconduct cases and allegations that we now are. So the times most certainly have changed, and there is need for very considerable improvement. Now, I have proposed and got support for these two amendments, which is why I'm bringing them to you this afternoon. They are, as Jeff said in his introduction, they are both about the same thing. The reason for there being two of them is to keep the constitutional amendments on the one hand in line with the business motion on the other hand. So there is nothing nefarious or underhand or anything about that. It's keeping everything in sync. Both deal with particular problems in what is proposed. The first is that it is essential to separate the group of people who carry out investigations of complaints from the group of people who adjudicate, who judge, who determine the outcome of those complaints, quite often based on the investigation. Now, there are many similar bodies to the type that we are trying to set up. Many similar quasi-legal disciplinary bodies in professional organisations and other organisations which do disciplinary procedures. But none of them allow the same small group of people to be both investigators and adjudicators at more or less the same time. None of them allow the same group of people to be the investigators, the prosecutors, the judge, and the jury. As it's currently written, unfortunately, the McDonald proposals would allow this. So what this amendment suggests is that there has to be clear separation during a single term of office between people who investigate and who then, in inverted commas, prosecute if the matter goes to a panel, and the people who judge, the people who determine the outcome. And those two must be kept separate. During one term of office, you have one role, but not both. Never do both, never do all of this at the same time. We must avoid creating a sort of self-contained group of people who train together, who work together, who appear in front of each other, who get to know each other actually probably quite well. There is a lot of disciplinary stuff out there. It's not one every 6 months or one every year. There are things every month, sometimes horribly every week, that have to be dealt with. We want these two groups to be separate. You think about it, they could go on being the same people working together for up to 10 years. So it does make sense to separate investigation from adjudication. It's just straightforward justice, really. It keeps the two sides separate. So we're proposing that instead of 50 sort of do-it-all people, there should be 15 investigators and 40 adjudicators, and that obviously, because those roles are actually different, they should be trained separately. The second part of the amendments recognises that it is enormously important that disciplinary procedures are carried out by members and for members and with the consent of members. As the proposals are currently written, it says just adjudicators. I'm hoping that you will vote for this so that it will be both the investigators and the adjudicators are nominated by the federal board. And it then says that list will be reported to conference. Conference, I don't think that that's quite good enough. I think that at the very least, that list or those lists should be voted on by conference to show that those people are actually acceptable to all of us. Otherwise, we've got a list of people sort of imposed on us. There's no choice, there's no buy-in, and the system will not have your confidence if you haven't been able to have some sort of say, some sort of buy-in into how it works. So, the McDonald aims, independent, I absolutely endorse, transparent, I absolutely endorse. We have liberal principles of democracy and of participation. And these amendments don't detract from the proposal. They improve the transparency of the whole process, and they make it much more accountable to you, the members. So please vote for the two amendments.
Thank you, Margaret. Would Liz Leffman from Witney please stand by? And I now call Leon Duveen from Bassett Law, who is a local party chair. He wishes to speak against the motion as a whole.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, Conference. I speak as somebody who chaired my regional local parties committee for 2 years, and I've known firsthand that our current disciplinary procedures are sadly lacking in many, many areas. And there's a lot needs to be done to improve them, but I don't think the proposals in this motion are the right way forward. They run the risk of making what could be, in many cases, small local issues into big national things where adjudicators are being called in who don't understand what's happening locally, and where the things that I did as a chair of LPC is by talking to one or two people, resolved an issue before it became too big. If we have adjudicators who don't understand what's happening, we'll end up with having complaints and dealing with problems on a much wider area. If I can, quickly, I'll just give you a couple of examples, and I will try not to identify anybody or any particular parties explicitly. Last summer, I got a complaint passed to me by compliance about 2 local activists and their behaviour at a local fair. The area happened to be an area where we were just starting to become very active, and the two people who were complained against were the 2 leading activists in that area. Now, the complaint was handed down to me from compliance. Luckily, it went to 1 or 2 other people, including my chair of the local party, chair of the local region, who told me that he knew that the people making the complaint were actually Labour Party activists making a malicious complaint against our members. And so I was able to deal with that complaint efficiently and quietly with a few words to the members involved to make sure they understood that they have to behave slightly better than they had done. They hadn't done anything particularly wrong. They may not have been, and they knew they had to improve it, but if somebody who had come in and not known the situation and handled a full-blown disciplinary procedure against those 2 members, we would have run the risk of stopping development in that area and giving the Labour Party everything they wanted. And the other issue was actually an issue about a sexual harassment case, which we dealt with, unfortunately. Now, the case was quite well founded, but the person being complained against had his own issues. The person had emotional and psychological problems, which meant if the complaint had not been handled very, very gently and carefully, we'd have run the risk of actually causing a bigger issue than just by simply suspending him and turning him off.
I'm going to have to ask his joy remarks to a close, Leon. Thank you.
Simply, it means I don't think having national adjudicators appointed to run the disciplinary procedure is the way forward.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Would Sarah Brown from Manchester Gorton please stand by? I now call Liz Leffman from Witney, who's the chair of the English Party, and she wishes to speak for the motion as a whole.
Good evening, Conference. I'm happy to support this motion, whether it's amended or not. And the reason that I'm happy to support it is because in my role as the chair of the English Party and in my previous role as chair of one of our regions, I have seen at first hand how our disciplinary processes currently work. And I want to start by giving credit to all those people who currently operate our disciplinary processes. They are volunteers. They work their socks off. I have seen the amount of work that has to be done by a small number of people, in many cases with no training, who have to decide on the basis of what they see and what they hear what to do about some very difficult issues, which in some cases even an HR professional would have difficulty dealing with. And that's why I really welcome the proposals that are being put forward today to take our disciplinary processes to a new level. Now, that does not mean, as Leon suggests, that we take it completely out of the hands of our local and regional parties. No, on the contrary. We need to give training to people at all levels in the party so that they can deal with some of these issues themselves. Quite often, in my personal experience, what happens is that there is some kind of thing that goes wrong at a local party level. The local party really doesn't know how to deal with it. We don't have trained mediators at the moment who can go in and try to help to sort things out, and we don't have people at regional level who are properly trained to deal with issues either. What I would love to think is that, in fact, the number of cases that end up being escalated to the adjudicators to deal with is relatively small, because we have within the party the processes that we need to make sure that we deal with things on the ground, unless they are really serious issues that have to go to a higher authority to look at. For example, in the case of some sexual harassment cases, as Isabel has outlined in her own in her proposal of this motion. So what I want to see is an English party, and indeed a Scottish and a Welsh party, that is properly prepared to handle disciplinary processes and has the backing of the federal party. We need much more strength within the party at the compliance level. Our compliance department is well overworked, And I therefore welcome this motion, and I look forward to working with the Federal Board, making sure that our state parties are fit for purpose when it comes to dealing with processes that at the moment our processes are completely out of date. As Margaret Jerkim said, these processes were designed in a different era, an era when social media did not exist. So we have to be fit for purpose. We have to go forward into this era believing that we can handle things effectively and judge people well and properly, and we need the people trained to do it. So that's where I'd like to see the effort going. I commend this motion to all of you today. I hope that you will vote for it, amended or unamended. It is really important that we change the way that we do things so that things are fair, so that things are delivered in the correct fashion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Would Alice Thomas from Southwark please stand by? And I now call Sarah Brown from Manchester, Gorton Central and Blackley, who is a Membership Development Officer. She is also against the motion.
It's Blakely.
I'm so sorry, Blakely.
Conference. I'm tired. Not just tired though, exhausted. Being a woman in our party is exhausting. I've been a member of the party now for just under 5 years, and unfortunately I have felt need to use the process in relation to sexual harassment issues. It took 13 months to resolve. No, not resolve, just to get an outcome, and an outcome which left me feeling quite cold. 13 months, it's not good enough conference. And it's not just me, but also the perpetrator. They were left hanging on for 13 months. It wasn't fair on either of us. A procedure is only as good as the least competent person using it, and it's only as quick as the person who's dragging their feet. I had a second complaint conference, and I did not feel safe in reporting it. That person would know who I was, and they would know it was me complaining. That person obtained my address through illegal means and sent me an unsolicited box containing a number of sex toys. I've still not reported it, but I'm not scared anymore. To you, if you're in here, that man who thought it was appropriate to do that, a grown man, shame on you. Which brings me to my final point, the culture in the party. The culture that means people think it's okay to grope each other, to harass each other, and to make people feel uncomfortable. It's not okay, and it's the responsibility of all of us in this room to stop it. We're Liberal Democrats, for God's sake. We don't take someone's liberty by groping them and making them feel uncomfortable. And until the culture changes, the policy is just a sticking plaster to the wider problem. I'm exhausted, conference, and until my faith is restored in the party, I just can't bring myself to vote for this, and I'm sorry.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Would Araya Babu from Camden Borough please stand by? And I now call Alice Thomas from Southwark, who's a member of the Federal Board, who wishes to speak for the motion as a whole, and lines 36 to 41 and 252 of F14.
Yeah, I'm here to support the motion as a whole, and particularly lines 36 to 41. I may have been a bit too ambitious to try and get 252 in as well, although I do support that line in particular. And when I was drafting my speaker's card for this motion, I had to think long and hard about which of the roles to put down in the which are your relevant roles for this, because since we started the governance review, I've been the Liberal Youth representative for Lib Dem Women, the Vice Chair of Lib Dem Women, the Chair of Lib Dem Women, the ex-Chair of Lib Dem Women, a member of the Federal Executive, now a member of the Federal Board. I've been on a borough party, a local party executive, and a branch party executive, and I've been sort of vaguely involved in the Newbies group and administering that online. And in every single one of those arrangements, I have had complaints brought to me. And in every single one of those complaints, they've been mired down by uncertainty about what the procedures are and who should be applying them and what timescales they have to meet and when they should be applied by those people, how they should be applied. So that's why I'm so proud of this report and of the changes that we're proposing to make through this constitutional amendment, because the process it sets out is so clear and so close to the best practice for voluntary organisations like ours. And while at the same time it manages to meet the principles of devolution and subsidiarity that we hold so dear as Liberal Democrats, and it reflects how our party functions. An essential part of the powers that we're going to need to be the professional voluntary organisation that we want to be is the ability to suspend respondents from the party as soon as a complaint is made against them. And that is the standard for workplaces, and in the charities I've worked for as a solicitor, it is completely normal practice, and it's done in a completely neutral way. And I think it's very clear in the report that Lord MacDonald has produced that that is the intention, that we have neutral suspension. And I think at the moment, if someone gets suspended, we open ourselves up to gossip by not explaining why. Why were they suspended when someone else wasn't? What does the party know about what they did that they're not telling us? Who holds a grudge and brought this to the party against them so that they would get suspended when somebody else didn't? I think we clear that up with this process by saying, we will suspend them in these circumstances. We will do it because with the support that the respondent needs after the suspension, and we will clearly explain to both the complainant and the respondent what the process for suspension and the reasons for suspension were. And I think to bring us into the 21st century, to bring us in line with voluntary best practice, we really need this power in here. So I urge you all to vote to keep those lines in the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alice. Would April Preston from Manchester Withington please stand by? And I now call Araya Babu from Camden Borough. She wishes to speak against some lines in F14.
Hello, conference. When I first joined the exec, the Young Liberals, we were given safeguarding training where the representative from HQ told us that as officers of the Young Liberals, if a member came to us with a sexual assault complaint, then we were legally required to bring this to the police. This was regardless of whether this was a friend telling you something in confidence, and more importantly, this was regardless of whether the victim in this case wanted you to go to the police. This is completely untrue. This is not the law. This was not the law. There are a number of organisations that can expel members for sexual harassment without reporting it to the police. A lot of professional organisations, places of work, schools, like a number of them. And they could do this because they use a balance of probabilities rather than beyond reasonable doubt, which is what you need to do in the case of law. And unlike us, they actually are able to do this while also respecting the wills of survivors, it seems. The arguments against this feel really obvious. As an officer, especially one with safeguarding duties, you need people to be comfortable to come to you with their complaints. In a lot of these cases, they don't want to go to the police. Sexual assaults are private things that are very difficult to prove in a lot of cases. The legal process is horrible. Victims often have their sexual history picked apart in front of a jury, and they often have to see their assaulter again, and they have to relive traumatic incidences. And after all this, they might still see the perpetrator walk away. In a lot of cases, they just want to move on, and they don't want to think about it again. So, when survivors know that in order to tell party officials about their assaults, they also need to go through the grueling machinations of the legal system, it means that a lot of them think it's much easier to just leave. When the Weinsteins of Westminster's accusations came out, a young activist, or ex-young activist, ended up in the Times talking about the ways in which the Lib Dems mishandle cases. She said, the general Lib Dem HQ approach to dealing with sexual assault complaints is to report it to the police and then hush it up. I know of a lot of members who feel this way, and I know about several who have left the party because of this. We talk about diversity a lot, but I don't think it's a surprise that we lack women in this party when this problem persists. This review seeks to, rather than address this problem, actually formalize it in our decision-making process, in our expulsion process. There are good things in here. I like the idea of there being training for investigators. But if we are going to solve this problem, we need to pass a real change that actually solves this problem rather than reinforces it. This motion is only going to make the issue worse. I would like to see this motion again at the next conference, but a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After this next speech, we're going to move to a mini-debate on the separate vote request, which is lines 36 to 41 at F14. So our first speaker on that will be David Hughes from Wells. Can he stand by, please? I now call April Preston from Manchester Withington, who wishes to speak against the motion as a whole.
Hi. First-time speaker, long-time activist, but more so than that, just a longer time irritated woman as a member of this party. I'm happy to support the work by the MacDonald report and the team as a whole, and I'd particularly like to give thanks to Isabel, because I know that she's worked so hard on this. As a party, we aim to be agents of change, and we do that by implementing progressive policy, and we never back down. We never back down when difficult situations arise. However, I do have a few concerns about the processes that are being proposed that I'm not entirely confident with. This seems to address a group of questions that are not actually the most prevalent. So like a Venn diagram, they're two separate circles. The big issues I don't feel are being directly responded to in this report currently. Both Vince and Sal have echoed the concerns that I and probably many of you in this room have with institutionalised power, gendered power, and I'm happy to be represented by the likes of Jo Swinson, and I see her as a role model in her ability to speak truth to power, and how power imbalances of this nature disproportionately affect women and marginalised groups. We must, within our own party, resolve the processes and address the concerns of sexual harassment, which have sought to dampen and darken our doorways for a long time. And I'm happy that that I gave evidence in this review, and I was happy that we were taking a user-led approach to such a difficult problem. With such serious allegations, in short, is that with these serious allegations, I'm worried that we haven't used the processes that we already have in front of us. So we're charging ahead with a different set of systems when we didn't listen to the last system. So we need to implement and roll out the recommendations of the Morrissey report, because it is my belief that they have not been adhered to. Where we are today, in this very conference, we're actually in contrary to some of the recommendations made in that report. I'll allude to that later. I hope that we'll implement a procedure which benefits women and marginalised groups, but this isn't yet it. Nor do I feel that the party has a full understanding or a handle on the importance of, say, anonymity. I don't yet think that we're currently coherent on risk reduction, and we need to put that in the heart of its plan going forward. This, ironically, would assist both parties of alleged groups, and if we had a better handle on these concerns, it would affect not just the people being accused, but the accusers themselves. And the current processes involved is currently letting all members down. So I suggest, with a sorry, heavy heart, that we vote this down.
Your remarks to a close, please.
And we bring it back to the drawing board. So, conference, please don't make me say this again next year. I hate to vote against it, but I see no other option. Implement the Morrissey report, and please remove that book from the exhibition hall.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And that was April's first speech at a federal conference. We're now going to move to a mini-debate, as I said, on lines 36 to 41 of F14. And I'm going to ask Carol Lindsay from West Lothian to stand by as our second speaker on that. Our first speaker is going to be David Hughes from Wells, who's chair of Western Counties Region. He's against the lines.
Thank you, Chair. Now, conference, one of the great positive things which has happened to the party in recent months has been the appointment of an excellent new chief executive, an experienced party activist since he was a young Liberal, a long-serving member of Parliament and a government minister in the coalition government. And we should be very grateful that he's taken on this role and that he now occupies that key, important position over the years ahead. However, we will not be showing our gratitude and appreciation to him if we encourage a situation in which he takes on the invidious and, yes, dare I say it, illiberal role outlined in these particular lines of the constitutional amendment. I say that because Liberals believe in two things. First of all, decisions of this nature should not be taken by a single person. And secondly, decisions of this nature should be taken by groups of elected people, not party employees, no matter how eminent they might be. And that is the situation which we would put the Chief Executive in these circumstances. Now, during the period of the coalition government, I was the regional chair in the Western Counties, and we had some difficult disciplinary issues come up. In one case in particular, the party leader, then the Deputy Prime Minister, was confronted on live radio with allegations about an individual party member. It was quite right that the party proceeded very rapidly to suspend that member whilst those allegations were considered through a legal process. What happened was that the party president, an elected person, one Tim Farron at the time, the chair of the English Party, an elected person, in consultation with lawyers and the Chief Executive, the elected people took the decision to suspend that member. That was all done very quickly in very pressing circumstances within an hour or two. Similarly, within an hour or two, I was on a train to go and meet the local party and their council group, who felt great loyalty to this individual, to explain why this was happening. It was a satisfactory process, it worked, and it didn't put a single member of staff into the invidious position of making the decision. It is not the Liberal way to do that, and it is not the Liberal way to expect a paid party employee, no matter how eminent, to do our dirty work for us. For that reason, I suggest that you should strongly delete those lines from the motion, and indeed, I think you should pay very careful attention to those who've suggested that the reform of this system has not been completed satisfactorily and needs further consideration. These matters are too important to get wrong, and if we need to look at them again over the months and ahead before perhaps another conference, we should do so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. All right, our next speaker, who I'm going to ask to stand by, is Brian Orell. After Brian Orell, I'm going to call Sal Brinton from Watford, so would please Brian and Sal stand by. I now call Karen Lindsay from West Lothian, who wishes to speak in favour of lines 36 to 41.
Conference, I'm glad we're having this separate vote debate, because suspending someone's membership is a really serious issue that should never be done lightly. And if we're going to have one individual to have that power, then we have to think about it, and we have to think about whether it is a necessary and proportionate step. Conference, sometimes you have to act quickly. You don't have 7 or 14 days to play around with. I think that I want to tell you about something that happened in Scotland. There was a situation where a member of the party was convicted of a very serious offence. That person was registered for conference, and under the Scottish Constitution, you have to convene a unanimous. You have to have a unanimous decision of the office bearers to suspend that person. The convener was out of the country on holiday, so I had to convene a meeting of the office bearers, a phone meeting, at very, very short notice, because this was just before conference. I actually convened that meeting in a hospital car park where my husband was being treated in accident and emergency. What if they hadn't been able to get hold of us? What if we hadn't been able to do that? Nobody else would have had the power to make that very necessary suspension. So all I'm saying is that there are those sorts of situations where you have to have that power. Most workplaces, as Alice was saying, most will have an immediate power of suspension in cases of gross misconduct. Now, if that person had been allowed to come to conference, there would have been a substantial risk to the safety of individuals. So it was very important that we took that step. So I hope that you will consider that this is a necessary step to be used in a very rare set of circumstances. And that chief executive obviously would be held accountable for those actions, and there's enough security and measures in place to ensure that it is not used inappropriately. So I hope that you will support those lines.
Thank you very much, Karen. After I call Sal Brinton, we're going to deal with the request for a reference back, which is from Vanessa King in Guildford. So would she stand by and be ready, please, if needed? I now call Brian Orell from Kensington and Chelsea, who wishes to speak against lines 248 to 251 of F14, which relate to the ability of the party president to appeal on behalf of the party.
Good afternoon, Conference. I wish to speak against lines 248 251. I had also wanted to speak against 36 to 41, but my objections to that have been very well covered by David Hughes, I think, in just 2 speeches ago. Conference, last autumn, when the EU withdrawal bill was being debated in Parliament, the former Conservative Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, led a brilliant and highly principled assault on what he called and christened the Henry VIII clauses, which gave Her Majesty's government unparalleled power to override almost any elected body in the UK after Brexit. Our own parliamentary party supported him and fought alongside MPs from all parties in the trenches who were opposed to this outrageous assumption of power by default. Yet here we are in a Liberal Democrat conference with a motion which, as Margaret and others have said, and Liz Leffman has said, has many, many good things in it. Here we are with a motion with actually 2 of our own Henry VIII clauses, one of which is lines 248 to 251, which allows the president of the party to be able to appeal against any decision that is by any panel or any appeal that he or she doesn't like or thinks that is going to endanger the party. Conference, at a stroke, that violates the core principle of all governance, that the executive and the judiciary are separate, and that the executive does not interfere in the judicial process. It's as fundamental as that. Once you start doing things like that, you are in an enormous amount of trouble, and nobody should have the power to make that decision. And of course, we can all say, well, of course, this is an emergency. The word emergency is used by governments all the time to cover things, state of emergency, that type of thing. It simply isn't good enough to use that kind of excuse to allow that kind of power in our party. So I hope you will, I would like to see a separate vote on that and for it to be rejected and taken out of this motion. Thank you very much, Conference.
Thank you, Brian. After our next speaker, we're going to deal with a request for a reference back. After that, if the motion's not referred back, I'm going to ask Prue Bray to summate on the amendment. So would she stand by, please, in case we get that far? I now call Sal Brinton from Watford, who's the party president, who wishes to speak for the motion as a whole.
Actually, Conference, I'm not going to speak about the motion as a whole, because the President and the Federal Board actually in the future will have no role other than the one that Brian just described, and I suspect that Ken MacDonald will address why he's put that in there. I've asked to speak because I wanted to respond to Sarah and April's very moving accounts and concerns on the legal advice that the party has had about whether we have to inform the police if a crime has been committed, and also the current position on anonymity. We sought that legal advice because we were utterly sympathetic to the concern about complainants. But our legal advice was absolutely clear. If we were aware of a possible crime by a member against another member or a member of the public, and we did not report it to the police, and that person then offended again, the party would be liable. Now, there is an important follow-on to that, which is that the complainants are not obliged to cooperate with the police, but the police can actually choose then to look at it. Now, that's been something that we have very carefully looked at, and in fact I asked Isabel Parasaran to look at it when she did her review. And it is difficult, but the one thing that has really depressed me as precedent in recent times has been when we know that people have done something before and they do it again. And finally, on anonymity. Anonymity is ensured up to the point at which there is a hearing, at which point it is only fair that the respondent understands who is making that complaint. This is at the moment. And then, absolutely, they have to be able to say, I don't even know X, or I wasn't in whichever place that X says I was at the time. But there isn't a question about providing lots of details. And Sarah, please do put in your complaint. One of the reasons that we are reviewing these processes is because we don't want any other complainant to have to face 13 months before a case gets heard.
Thank you very much, Sal. Will Prue Bray from Wokingham please stand by? But before that, we're going to deal with the request for a reference back. I, in fact, had two requests for a reference back. One was in order, one wasn't. I'm going to take the one that was in order. Now, the way a request for a reference back works is this. If you're constitutionally minded, and you may all be having come into this debate, it's at the procedures at page 81 to 82 of the agenda. A reference back is a request to refer the whole motion back for discussion at a future conference and consideration by another party body. What I'm going to do is read the statement of reasons in support of the reference back that has come from Vanessa King of Guildford. I'm going to read that statement out. I'm then going to ask you whether, on the strength of that statement, you want to consider in more detail the request for a reference back. If you do, I will then have a 2-minute speech from Vanessa and a 2-minute speech from Isabel Parasaran, who will oppose it. So I'm going to read the statement of reasons to you now. It's this. I would like to submit a reference back to Federal Board because while we need an improved disciplinary process, the proposals currently put forward are fundamentally flawed and need substantial revision. Reform is essential, but current amendments are unworkable, lacking detail and lacking accountability. That is the statement of reasons. I'm going to ask you now to vote on whether you want to consider that in more detail. Can I see all those in favour of considering that in more detail and having two speeches? Get the lights up, please, so I can see a little more clearly. Thank you. Nice and high, if you wouldn't mind. Word voting towards me. All those in favour? All those against? What do you think? Yes, that's in favour of having a mini debate on that. It's 2-minute speeches now on the lights, please. I'm going to ask Isabel Parasaran to stand by to respond. I'm going to ask Vanessa King from Guildford first, please, to come forward and explain why she would like the motion referred back to Federal Board.
Chair, Conference, I'm asking for a reference back to the Federal Board on this motion because while we do absolutely need an improved disciplinary process, the proposals currently before Conference are fundamentally flawed. Substantial revision is essential if we're to have a process that is workable, accountable, and above all, in alignment with our values as Liberal Democrats. The amendments as written are unworkable because the timescales are too short and there is no commitment to providing and maintaining the resources needed. The amendments lack detail on fundamental processes, such as how an investigation or hearing will be conducted or on how activities will be reported to members. The amendments are lacking scrutiny and accountability. Members are not involved in setting up the process, nor are they involved in making it work. If we refer this motion back to the Federal Board, we will be able to construct a process that is truly simple, transparent, efficient, and above all, liberal. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I now call Isabel Parasaran for her 2-minute speech against the request for a reference back.
Thank you for the comments that you've made, Vanessa. I think I can clarify some of the issues that are concerning people in this room. One of the things that I'm at a disadvantage at to some extent is that my report is embargoed, and so you have no idea of the contents of it. That's the case for many of you. However, one of the things that I recommended was that a steering group be set up. And the steering group will address many of the issues that people here are concerned about. So, for example, the issue on anonymity, referrals to police, that's something that has to be reviewed on a regular basis. Safeguarding, child protection, sexual harassment, those sort of issues are formed on the basis of a network of legal precedent as well as policy and procedure, and that is constantly evolving. That's one of the specialisms that I'm engaged in, not only in the field of law, but in the field of education, and I have to stay on top of that on a very regular basis. And so I felt it important that we have a steering group that would constantly be reviewing the way in which we approach particularly sexual harassment cases. The other issue that I'd like to raise is that the fleshing out that has been requested will be overseen by the steering group. So the guidance that you're looking for and the detail that appears to be lacking will be put in place by the steering group in terms of its oversight, but by somebody who will be appointed by the party who will do some of the detail. And so I hope that that addresses some of the concern, but I would also refer to the fact that since 2013, we have had consultations and stakeholder interviews in order to get to the point that we're at now. And so I hope that the gaps that are missing will be filled in by the work that the steering group will be performing, and I hope that as you see the work that they're doing and that the engagement that they participate in with ordinary party members will give you the confidence that what Lord MacDonald is proposing is a foundation for the way forward, where you will see the way in which it works in fuller detail as we proceed. So I urge you to vote in favour of the motion completely today.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, the request is to refer the motions back to the Federal Board. I'm going to take a vote on that now. If you're voting, can you please hold your cards nice and high so I can see them? And have the lights up, please. Can I see all those in favour of the reference back to the Federal Board? Can I see all those against, please? It's not. Can I see that again, please? Can I see all those in favour of the reference back? And all those against? I think we're going to have to count that. I just can't tell, I'm afraid. It's very close. Could the stewards please prepare for a count? We are going to run over slightly on this debate, but it's extremely important, given the seriousness of the issues that all the speakers have addressed, that we get this absolutely right. So would the stewards stand by, please? Could we have some quiet in the auditorium, if you don't mind? What I'm going to do now is hand the floor over to our massively experienced and expert stewards team who are going to count your votes. When I'm given the signal that we can proceed, I'm going to ask to see the vote again. I'd like you, for the sake of the stewards, please to hold your cards up as high as you possibly can so it's clearly visible for them to see. Right, we're going to proceed now. Can I see all those in favour of referring the motions back to the Federal Board? And can I see all those against, please? Nice and high again, please, so the stewards can all count your votes. Thank you very much indeed. Could you please have a round of applause for our stewards? They really are first class. They run this conference as volunteers, ever welcoming, ever helpful, and they perform these counts exceptionally well and exceptionally smoothly, as you will see. What's going to happen now is they'll total up all of the figures from all of the blocks. I'll be given the figures. I'll let you know what they are, obviously. If the motion is not referred back, we'll be moving to the summations. The first of those summations will be Prue Bray from Wokingham. So depending on the result of the reference back vote, would she stand by, please? After that, I'll call Lord Ken MacDonald to summate on the motions as a whole. Obviously, if the motion is referred back, it will go back to the federal board and doubtless come forward again as a future conference, but we'll see about that in just a moment. There were a number of people I couldn't call in this debate who put in cards. I apologise for that. We've actually turned out to be very short of time indeed in this debate. And I'm grateful to all the speakers for keeping to time, which have helped us to call more people. So we'll just pause for a moment and wait for the stewards to total up the votes for us. All right, I think we have a result. For the reference back, 102. Against the reference back, 100. The motion is referred back by 2 votes. We were right to count it. We were right to get it right.